Hello everyone, and welcome to another Paranormal M video. If you enjoy the stories, please give the video a like. And if you have ever had an unexplained experience, please send it to me. Tonight's first story is about a woman who believes she met something unusual while she was newly pregnant. A stranger approached her car, asked whether she had children, and then was suddenly nowhere to be seen. The whole thing only lasted a few moments, but it stayed with her for years. Get comfortable, and I hope you all relax, sleep well, and have a good night. I've had a few experiences in my life that I still can't explain. Some people might call them strange encounters. Others might say they were coincidences. But deep down, I believe I've come into direct contact with something dark. Something evil. When people talk about demons, they usually describe terrifying faces or unnatural creatures. I don't picture them that way. I think they can hide inside ordinary people. People you might pass on the street without giving them a second glance. I also believe children can sense them. Children notice things adults have learned to ignore. They sometimes become uneasy around certain people for no obvious reason, and I don't think we should always dismiss that. Maybe they're seeing something we can't. The first time I experienced something like this was about 13 years ago. I had recently discovered I was pregnant. I wasn't showing yet, and hardly anyone knew. One afternoon, I stopped at a small shopping center on my way home. The parking lot was unusually quiet. I stayed in my car for a few minutes because I had been feeling nauseous. The doors were locked, but I had left the driver's side window open just a couple of inches. The fresh air helped settle my stomach. I was looking down at my phone when I suddenly felt something beside me. It wasn't a sound. It was more like a pressure, or the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. When I looked up, an elderly woman was walking directly toward my car. She was small and neatly dressed, with pale gray hair. There was nothing obviously threatening about her, but the way she stared at me made my entire body tense. Her eyes never left mine. As she reached the window, I instinctively leaned away from her. She moved close enough to speak through the narrow opening. Then she smiled. It was a calm smile, but there was something deeply wrong about it. She asked, "Do you have any children?" Without even thinking, I answered, "No." She continued staring at me and slowly nodded. "That's good," she said. "That's very good." The moment she said it, I felt a cold wave move through me. I shifted toward the center console and checked that the door was locked. The woman held my gaze for another second before turning and walking behind my car. I immediately rolled up the window. Then I checked every mirror. I looked to my left, to my right, and across the parking lot. Finally, I twisted around in my seat to find her. She was gone. There were no nearby cars she could have entered. There were no buildings close enough for her to have reached so quickly. The parking lot was almost empty, and yet she had vanished in seconds. I drove home without going inside the store. At the time, I couldn't fully understand why the encounter had frightened me so badly. It wasn't until later that I remembered her question. "Do you have any children?" I had told her no, but technically, that wasn't true. I was already carrying my child. Sometimes I wonder whether she knew. I wonder whether that was the reason she approached me in the first place. And I wonder whether some instinct inside me understood the danger before my mind did. Maybe that's why I said no. Even now, all these years later, I can still see her face. I can still hear the strange satisfaction in her voice when she said, "That's good." I don't know exactly what stood beside my car that afternoon, but I have never believed it was simply an old woman. We lived in this old farmhouse in rural Vermont for a while. It had been built sometime in the late 1800s, and you could feel its age the moment you stepped inside. The floors creaked, the walls seemed to hold every sound, and the whole place had this strange sense of memory about it. The family who had owned it the longest lived there from around the 1930s until the early 1970s. They had a son who never came home from the war. Then, years later, another owner passed away inside the house and wasn't found for nearly a week. People in town said he'd become a recluse and had filled several rooms with old newspapers and boxes. There was one doorway between the study and my parents' bedroom that always felt especially wrong. The air around it seemed heavier somehow, almost thick. I had to pass the study whenever I went upstairs to my room, and I absolutely hated doing it at night. That room never felt empty. During the day, it felt as though someone was sitting quietly inside, listening. At night, it felt much worse. Walking past the doorway gave me this overwhelming fear that a hand might reach out, grab me, and pull me into the darkness. And I wasn't a child when this happened. I was in my 20s. I knew the difference between an overactive imagination and the feeling that something was genuinely off. Small objects moved around the house all the time. We had this tiny ceramic sailor that had come inside a box of tea. We kept it on the kitchen windowsill, but it would turn up on the table, beside the sink, or on top of the refrigerator. Sometimes it moved when nobody had been home. Kitchen drawers would slide open on their own, too. You'd hear the wooden runners scraping from another room, walk in to investigate, and find a drawer pulled almost completely out. We also saw movement in the corners of our vision. A figure crossing a hallway, a shadow passing a doorway. You'd turn your head and there would be nothing there. But twice, I saw something directly in front of me. The first time, my sister was standing in the dining room while I was in the kitchen. We were cleaning and talking about what still needed to be done. Behind her was a narrow cupboard that had once been a doorway leading down to the cellar. As I looked at her, I saw part of a man walk behind her. I couldn't see his face or his legs. What I saw was a gray, old-fashioned coat moving steadily across the room. I could make out the collar, the shoulder seams, even the folds in the fabric. It passed behind my sister and disappeared straight through the old cellar doorway. My sister stopped talking. She looked at my face and said, very quietly, "What is standing behind me?" The second time happened in my bedroom. My room was upstairs, and I kept my bed pushed close to the windows. I loved falling asleep with the cool air coming in and looking out over the fields. That night, I was thinking about a long road trip my sister and I were leaving for the next morning. I suddenly had the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. I turned slightly, and there was a young woman standing beside my bed. She had a pale, oval face, and her hair was parted in the middle and pulled neatly back, the way women wore it in old photographs from the mid-1800s. She wasn't glowing or transparent. She was simply there, looking down at me. Strangely, I wasn't frightened. I had the feeling that she had come to see me before I left, almost as though she were saying goodbye. I blinked, and she was gone. I just rolled back over and continued looking out the window. My father saw things in that house too. On 2 separate occasions, he was sitting in his chair in the study when he saw a young woman come down the stairs, cross the hall, and enter the dining room. Both times, he assumed it was me, but I was upstairs and hadn't moved. We were the only 2 people home. Outside the house, there was another figure I saw again and again. In the mornings, while I was heading out to feed the animals, I would notice a man crossing the field. He wore a white shirt with dark suspenders. I never saw him while looking directly at him. He was always just off to the side, at the edge of my vision. Whenever I turned to get a proper look, the field was empty. One afternoon, I was alone in the kitchen when I heard the front door open and close at the opposite end of the house. Then I heard my father talking to the dogs. I was surprised because I believed he was working several states away. I walked through the house, expecting to find him taking off his coat or standing in the hallway. Nobody was there. Every door was locked. That same front door caused strange experiences constantly. Even when we were elsewhere in the house, we would feel it open and shut. The pressure in the room would shift, followed by the deep sensation of the door closing. Sometimes there wasn't even a sound. You would simply feel the impact travel through the house. We moved often when I was growing up because of my father's job, and that wasn't the first old house I'd lived in. In New England, buildings come with long histories, and sometimes it feels as though the people who lived in them never completely left. People often say living in a haunted house sounds exciting. It really isn't. The occasional strange noise or moving object is one thing. What wears you down is the constant feeling of being observed. The sense that someone is standing behind you or leaning over your shoulder, even though you can't see anyone. I haven't lived in a house like that for many years now, and honestly, I don't think I'd ever choose to again. When I was little, maybe 4 or 5, my mom said I gave her quite a scare. One morning I told her I dreamed about an elderly man sitting with me on the sofa. He had his arm around me, almost like he was keeping me safe. I'd never seen him before, but I remember telling her that I wasn't afraid of him at all. He felt kind. My mom assumed it was just a childhood dream and didn't think much more about it. About a week later, we visited my uncle's house. It was my first time there. While wandering through the hallway, I noticed an old photograph hanging near one of the bedrooms. I pointed at it and said, "That's him. That's the man who sat with me in my dream." My mom froze. The man in the photograph was my great-grandfather, Henry. He had passed away long before I was born. We didn't have any pictures of him at home, my dad had never met him, and his name almost never came up in conversation. Later, one of my relatives explained that great-grandpa Henry had always been the one looking after the younger children in the family. He loved caring for his grandchildren and was known for quietly watching over everyone. Then my aunt shared something even stranger. When my dad was very young, he used to laugh and play with someone no one else could see. Whenever the family asked who he was talking to, he would simply say, "Grandpa." I've always wondered whether some ancestors stay close, checking in from time to time, just to see how the family is growing. Years later, when I was 13, I was living with my maternal grandmother. My grandfather had passed away suddenly, and the loss changed the entire feeling of the house. For several months, my grandmother and I stayed somewhere else. When we finally returned, we only used certain parts of the home. Our bedrooms were upstairs, while the kitchen and living room remained open downstairs. My grandfather's old bedroom stayed closed. During the first week back, something happened that I've never been able to explain. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of coffee brewing. I could hear the liquid pouring into a mug, and I could smell the coffee drifting through the house. Then I heard the basement door open, followed by slow footsteps going down the stairs. That was exactly what Grandpa Arthur used to do. He would wake at unusual hours, pour himself a cup of coffee, and head into the basement for a quiet smoke before settling in front of the television. As I lay there listening, I heard footsteps coming back up from the basement. The door closed, and then someone began climbing the staircase toward the second floor. The steps stopped outside my grandmother's bedroom. Her dogs didn't bark or growl. Instead, They began softly whining and breathing excitedly, almost as though they recognized whoever was standing there. Then the footsteps moved toward my room. A shadow appeared beneath my door. Someone was standing directly outside. The doorknob never turned. The door never opened. Whoever it was simply remained there while I lay completely still, holding my breath beneath the covers. After a while, the shadow moved away. I heard the footsteps descend the stairs, cross the kitchen, and stop near the coffee maker. A moment later, the machine clicked off. Then the basement door opened and closed once more, and the footsteps disappeared down the stairs. The following morning, I asked my grandmother whether she had gotten up during the night. She looked confused and said, "No, but the kitchen smelled like coffee when I woke up." "That's strange because I don't drink it, and the coffee maker has been packed away under the cabinet since we came home." Nothing like that ever happened again. Part of me believes Grandpa Arthur was simply following his familiar routine one last time. Maybe he wanted to check on my grandmother, pause outside my room, and let us know that even though he was gone, he had found his way home. I've always been pretty open-minded about things I couldn't explain. Even as a kid, I had a few strange experiences, but there was always some reasonable excuse. Maybe I hadn't slept enough. Maybe my imagination was running wild. Maybe the house was settling. So for years, I treated those moments with a shrug and moved on. That changed when I found out my mother had cancer. As her health declined, I started asking questions I hadn't seriously considered in a long time. Is there an afterlife? Are spirits real? Is there something waiting for us after all of this? I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted proof. Something undeniable. When my mother eventually passed away, I fell into a deep depression. I don't think I ever truly got over losing her. I learned how to keep living, but the grief stayed with me, quietly following me from one year to the next. For a long time, I avoided my father's house. It was the same home where my mother had died, and being there carried too much weight. But several years later, I was going through a difficult period and needed somewhere to stay for a couple of nights. That first evening back, I slept in the living room because my old bedroom had become a storage room. My father had a few small black dogs. I'd known them for years, so I was familiar with their habits. They were usually calm at night, especially once they had settled together in their kennel. I was lying on the couch getting ready to get sleep when one of the dogs let out a low growl. At first, I ignored it. A few moments later, she growled again. I quietly told her, "Shh." The kitchen light was still on, casting a soft glow into the otherwise dark living room. I looked over at her, and she immediately looked back at me. I figured she was annoyed with one of the other dogs, so I let it go. Then, about a minute later, she growled a third time. This time, something felt different. When I looked at her, she wasn't watching the other dogs. She was staring past them, completely focused on the kitchen. I told her to be quiet again, but she didn't even acknowledge me. Her eyes remained fixed on something I couldn't see, so I followed her gaze. Above the kitchen table, directly beneath the ceiling fan, there was a thick patch of mist hovering in the air. The fan wasn't moving. There was no smoke, no steam, and nothing nearby that could have created it. It didn't have a clear shape. It looked almost like a small cloud suspended beneath the fan blades. For a moment, I wondered whether I was actually seeing something paranormal or whether grief had finally begun playing tricks on my mind. But then a deep sense of calm came over me. I wasn't frightened. I didn't feel threatened. Somehow, without being able to explain why, I simply thought, okay, that's Mom. It felt as though she was letting me know she was still there. The mist remained for less than a minute, and then it slowly disappeared. But the feeling stayed. I had returned to that house at one of the lowest points in my life, after staying away for years. Looking back, I believe that moment was her way of reassuring me that I wasn't alone. I don't share this story very often because it feels deeply personal. I'm not trying to convince anyone, and I have nothing to gain from telling it. I understand skepticism because I used to be a skeptic myself. But after that night, I couldn't dismiss the possibility anymore. Whatever that presence was, I believe it was my mother. And for one quiet moment, when I needed her most, she found a way to remind me that she was still with me. I should start by saying I'm still pretty skeptical about paranormal stories. My first real introduction to that world was through shows where investigators spent just as much time disproving things as they did chasing ghosts. I appreciated that. A strange sound could be old plumbing. A shadow could be headlights. A cold spot could be a draft. But there's one experience I've never been able to explain. Years ago, I worked at a living history museum. I won't say which one, because the official position was that the property was absolutely not haunted. Unofficially, nearly every employee had heard the stories. Management probably wanted to avoid frightening visitors or losing staff. One coworker actually quit after hearing too many of the stories. They also didn't want amateur ghost hunters sneaking onto private property after hours. About half the buildings had some kind of legend attached to them. A few stories could easily have been employees in period clothing being mistaken for apparitions, but others were harder to dismiss. The building connected to my experience was a one-room schoolhouse. According to the legend, it was haunted by a young boy the staff called Little Benny Blue. People described him as wearing a blue sailor-style outfit, the kind a child might have worn in the early 1900s. Inside the schoolhouse were 3 rows of wooden desks, an old wood-burning stove near the entrance, and a chalkboard at the front. There was also a raised platform with the teacher's podium, a bench, a wooden chair, and an old American flag with the historically correct number of stars. Nearly everything in the room was made of wood. The desks were held together with old-fashioned square nails, possibly cut nails or rosehead nails. During the summer, I was assigned to cover breaks for several historic houses and the schoolhouse. One afternoon, I went inside to relieve the employee working there so she could take her lunch. At the time, the schoolhouse was being used as a craft station. The exact craft changed from week to week, but that day the tables were covered with construction paper, glue sticks, and safety scissors. Once my coworker had left, I checked to make sure there were no visitors, supervisors, or other employees nearby. Then, feeling slightly ridiculous, I started talking to Little Benny Blue. I told him that if he was really there, he could knock over a glue stick. I said he could move some paper or disturb one of the craft supplies. Nothing dramatic, just something small. For a while, nothing happened. I was standing near the front of the room, looking toward the teacher's platform. Then I turned toward the entrance to see whether my coworker was coming back. Nobody was there. When I turned around again, an old square nail was lying on the floor near the platform. That stopped me cold. The floor was wooden. The desks were wooden. The podium was wooden. Anything metal falling in that room should have made a sharp, unmistakable sound. I hadn't heard anything. I picked up the nail and examined the teacher's desk, because it was the only nearby object it could reasonably have come from. I searched for a loose joint, an empty nail hole, or any sign that something had fallen apart. There was nothing. The desk was solid. I placed the nail on top of it and waited for my coworker to return. When she came back, I showed her where I had found it without telling her that I had been talking to the ghost. She looked genuinely confused. She hadn't seen the nail there before leaving for lunch. We agreed to mention it to a supervisor, but neither of us had an explanation. that wasn't the last strange nail incident in the schoolhouse. Several months later, during the Christmas season, the building had been turned into a holiday craft area. Children made cards and ornaments, and there were forms for writing letters to Santa. At the beginning and end of every shift, I checked inside the desks. Visitors were always leaving things behind or stuffing supplies into places they didn't belong. One evening, I was checking the room with another employee. I had worked there the previous night, so I knew the desks had been cleared. My coworker was teasing me for being so thorough until I reached one particular desk. There was an old nail connecting the seat to the desk behind it. Normally, that nail was buried so firmly in the wood that it would have taken a tool to remove it. I knew because, during a quiet shift, I had once tried. That evening, the nail was sticking halfway out. My coworker stopped laughing. I reached down and pulled it free with my fingers. It had not been loose the night before. I took the nail straight to the front desk and showed the first supervisor I saw. Maintenance replaced it before my next shift. There were other odd incidents involving smaller nails and screws appearing inside the old stove. I would check it at the beginning of a shift and find it empty. A few hours later, there would sometimes be several pieces of hardware inside. Those incidents were easier to explain away. The building had plenty of visitors, and maintenance workers came and went throughout the day. Someone could have dropped the pieces in as a joke. Even the nail sticking out of the desk might have been loosened by a maintenance worker who forgot to return and finish the job. But that first nail is different. I was alone. The floor was clear. Nobody entered the building. Nothing made a sound. I asked a little boy in blue to move something. Then I turned around and found an old nail lying where it hadn't been moments before. I'm still a skeptic, but I kept that nail. I was about 11 years old when my family took a weekend trip to Vancouver Island. It was my mom, my dad, my older brother, my sister, and me. My aunt came too, along with a close friend of hers and her friend's husband, who I'll call Gareth. Gareth was competing in a local strength competition, so the whole reason for the trip was to cheer him on and make a little family getaway out of it. We stayed in a quiet little town at an old hotel that looked as though it belonged to another century. I remember the woman at the front desk telling us the building was more than 100 years old. The place was tiny, only 3 floors, with fewer than a dozen rooms on each level. Our entire group was placed on the 3rd floor, and as far as we knew, we had that floor completely to ourselves. My aunt, Gareth, and their friend stayed in a small room near one end of the hallway. My family had a larger room with 3 beds at the opposite end. The hallway was shaped like an L, so you couldn't see one room from the other without walking around the corner. One afternoon, everyone was relaxing in our room. We were talking, joking around, and resting after being out most of the day. At some point, my aunt asked me to go to her room and bring something back for her. I honestly can't remember what it was. Since nobody else was staying on the floor, they had left their door open. I stepped into the hallway and started walking toward their room. The moment I rounded the corner, I could see directly through their open doorway. Standing right in front of it were my brother and sister. They were side by side, almost shoulder to shoulder, with their backs mostly turned toward me. I could see just enough of their faces from the side to recognize them. They were even wearing the same clothes I had seen them wearing only seconds earlier. But that was the problem. I had just left them behind me in our family's room. They couldn't possibly have reached the other end of the hallway before me. There was no second exit, and they would have had to pass right by me. A horrible feeling settled over me. I remember trying to sound normal when I called out, "What are you two doing?" Neither of them answered. They simply walked through my aunt's open doorway and disappeared around the corner inside the room. I followed them immediately. I couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 seconds behind, but when I entered the room, nobody was there. The room was incredibly small. It had 2 beds, a narrow closet, and a tiny bathroom. There was nowhere for 2 people to disappear. I checked under both beds. I opened the closet. I looked behind the bathroom door and even pulled back the shower curtain. Nothing. I was completely alone. The fear that hit me in that moment is difficult to describe. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel during a scary movie. It felt heavier than that, almost physical, as though the room itself had suddenly become wrong. I ran back down the hallway as fast as I could. When I rushed into our room, my brother and sister were still sitting on the bed, laughing with everyone else. They hadn't moved. From the way everyone was acting, it was obvious they had been there the entire time. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I was too frightened, but I was also embarrassed. I thought maybe my mind had played some strange trick on me. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had somehow hallucinated the whole thing. So I kept it to myself for years. Eventually, I told my parents and a handful of people I trusted, but I always ended the story by saying that I had probably imagined it. That explanation was easier to live with. Then, nearly 17 years later, something happened that changed everything. My family was having a house party. There were relatives, friends, and guests everywhere. At one point, I walked over to where my brother was talking with a couple of people about unexplained experiences. I arrived just as he began telling them about something that had happened to him when he was around 13. He said it happened during a family trip to Vancouver Island at an old hotel. The moment he said that, I stopped moving. He explained that he had been downstairs in the lobby and decided to return to our room to get something. When he reached the 3rd floor and stepped into the hallway, he saw me standing near our family's room. Not someone who vaguely resembled me. He saw me exactly as I had looked at that age, wearing the clothes I had been wearing that day. He called my name, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it walked straight through the closed door of our hotel room. I had never told my brother what I saw at that hotel, and until that moment, he had never told me what he saw. I interrupted him and finally shared my own story in front of everyone. I told him how I had seen him and our sister standing outside my aunt's room, how they had walked inside, and how they had vanished within seconds. I still remember the look on his face. For the first time, neither of us had to wonder whether we had simply imagined what happened. Our experiences were separate, but they reflected each other in a way that felt impossible to dismiss. I don't know what was inside that old hotel. I don't know whether it was haunted, whether something was imitating us, or whether there is some explanation neither of us has considered. I only know what I saw, and after hearing my brother's story 17 years later, I finally believed myself. Before I tell you what happened, I should probably explain that I frightened my family long before I understood why. I grew up as the oldest of 5 children. We lived in a roomy apartment building on the edge of a quiet town. There was nothing sinister about the place. It wasn't abandoned or falling apart, and there were no dark alleyways outside. It was simply a warm, cluttered home with family photographs on the walls and too many shoes by the front door. But at night, I became a completely different person. I would sleepwalk through the hallway, whisper to people who weren't there, and sometimes wake up screaming so loudly that our neighbors would knock on the walls. Other nights, I would cry in my sleep until the entire household was awake. Because I was the eldest, people assumed I would be the responsible one. Instead, I was the reason my parents were constantly exhausted. They took me to doctors, sleep specialists, and counselors. Some thought I was anxious. Others wondered whether I had experienced something traumatic that I couldn't remember. I was given sleeping tablets, calming medication, antidepressants, and melatonin in almost every form imaginable. Nothing stopped the dream. It always began in the same place. I was a younger version of myself, sitting in a backyard I had never seen before. The grass was pale and slightly overgrown, and beyond the fence stood a row of trees that seemed too still. I would be playing with a doll. At first, it looked ordinary, although its face always resembled someone in my family. Sometimes it looked like my mother, sometimes one of my younger brothers. Once, it even looked like me. Then I would glance down and notice that the doll's wrists and ankles were wrapped in thick iron chains. The weight would suddenly become unbearable. My arms would ache as though the chains were pulling on my own bones, and I would drop the doll onto the grass. That was when the rain would begin. Only one drop at first, cold against my forehead. Then I would turn around and see her. She was impossibly tall, with a neck that stretched far beyond what looked human. Her arms hung almost to the ground, and there was a dark mole directly beneath her lower lip. The worst part was her eyes. She had no eyelids. She would lean down until her face was beside mine and whisper a warning into my ear. The message was different every time. Someone you love will leave. Do not trust the person at the door. Grief has already found your house. After she spoke, pressure would build around my throat. It felt like invisible hands tightening around my neck. I would look down and see my reflection trembling in the puddles, my face turning darker as the pain spread through my chest and legs. My whole body felt as though it were burning from the inside. Then I would wake up. At least, I thought I was awake. I would be lying in bed, unable to move, while the same woman stood beside me. She would place one long finger against her lips and slowly lower her face toward mine. Her breath was freezing cold, and it carried the smell of spoiled meat and wet soil. "Don't tell them who I am," she would whisper. When I finally regained control of my body, my throat would be painfully sore, and my legs would ache so badly that walking felt difficult. One morning, after finding me crying beside my bed, my mother took me to another therapist. During the drive, she kept talking about how expensive the appointment was and begging me to explain everything clearly this time. The moment I entered the therapist's office, I broke down. I told him about the backyard, the chained doll, the warnings, and the woman without eyelids. I described her long arms, the mark beneath her mouth, and the way her fingers seemed to crush my throat. I was terrified, but I was also relieved. For the first time, I had ignored her warning and told someone everything. The therapist listened quietly. Then he suggested that my parents buy me stronger melatonin gummies and establish a calmer bedtime routine. That was all. When we arrived home, I removed my shoes by the door and immediately noticed a terrible smell coming from the hallway. It was thick, sour, and unmistakably rotten. The closer I walked toward my bedroom, the stronger it became. I already knew something was waiting for me. My hands were shaking when I opened the door. There was a dead fox lying on the carpet beside my bed. Its fur was wet and matted. Flies crawled around its eyes, and small white larvae moved beneath its stomach. I had no idea how it had entered the apartment or how long it had been there. Then I noticed something beside its front paw. A fingernail. It was long, cracked, and coated with dark dirt. It looked exactly like the nails that had pressed into my throat during the dream. After that day, objects began disappearing from my room. First, it was a brass key my grandmother had given me. Then a stuffed rabbit I had slept with since I was little. Later, several photographs vanished from a drawer that no one else was allowed to touch. The missing items were never found, but something was always left behind. a strand of coarse black hair, a broken piece of yellowed nail. Once I found a wet handprint beneath my pillow. I understood what she was telling me. I had spoken about her, and now she wanted me to know that she could reach me even when I was awake. A few years later, my family moved to another town. The very first night in our new house, I slept without dreaming. The woman never returned, and eventually, the memories faded so completely that I almost convinced myself they had never been real. Then, many years later, I found an old notebook from one of my childhood counseling sessions. Most of the pages contained simple drawings of my family and our apartment. But near the back, there was a picture of a tall woman standing beside a small child. Her arms reached down to her ankles. Her eyes had no lids. Beneath the drawing, in my childhood handwriting, I had written, "She knows where we are." The moment I read those words, I remembered everything. The weight around my throat, the cold breath against my skin, and the terrible smell that always appeared just before she came close. Okay, so I should start by saying I'm not really a supernatural person. I love horror movies. I love Halloween. I love the idea of ghosts, haunted houses, and all those unsettling little stories people tell around a fire. But when it comes to what I actually believe, I'm usually pretty skeptical. Still, some strange things have been happening in my apartment lately, and I'm beginning to wonder whether they're all random accidents or pieces of something bigger. I've lived here for almost a year now. Before this, I stayed in the same apartment for about 6 years, and even there, I occasionally wondered whether something unusual was going on. A framed album cover fell off the wall and broke more than once. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and find an object sitting in the middle of the floor, even though I didn't remember leaving it there. But things fall. People forget where they put things. Buildings shift. And because I watch far too many creepy movies, my imagination is always ready to put on a tiny detective hat and announce that a ghost did it. I've also had moments when I thought I could feel my late best friend nearby. That feeling has faded over the years, but it still happens occasionally. Part of me also believes I may have lived before, although I have absolutely no proof of that. So I suppose I'm open-minded, but cautious. I even own a spirit board, but I've never had the pointer move without someone touching it. Nothing dramatic has ever happened. No mysterious messages. No candles blowing out. No Victorian child appearing in the corner. Then I moved into this apartment. Almost immediately, the place felt different. The entire complex has a slightly eerie atmosphere. It's surrounded by marshland, old trees, and curtains of Spanish moss. At night, the whole area looks like it was designed by someone whose only instruction was, make it beautiful, but unsettling. Inside my apartment, I sometimes hear noises that I can't identify. I've always felt an odd energy here, but for a long time, it was nothing serious enough to mention. Over the last few months, though, the strange moments have started piling up. At first, I thought something was turning on my television. I'd be in another room and suddenly hear dialogue or music playing. Eventually, I figured out that it was a technical glitch. If I let the television fall asleep instead of switching it off completely, the sound from whatever I had been watching would sometimes start playing again while the screen stayed dark. Creepy, yes. Paranormal? Probably not. But there are other things I still can't explain. One afternoon, I came home and found every bottle from the shelf in my shower lying in the bottom of the tub. Shampoo, conditioner, body wash, all of it. A friend suggested that maintenance work in the apartment above mine might have caused the wall to vibrate. That's possible, although the shelf is positioned in a way that makes it seem unlikely that every bottle would fall at once. Then there were the plants. I have 4 tiny artificial plants sitting on my kitchen windowsill. The blinds hang behind them, so people walking outside can see the plants without seeing into the apartment. One day, I came home and found all 4 plants scattered across the kitchen counter. They hadn't simply tipped over. They looked as though they had somehow been pushed forward through the blinds and thrown onto the counter. I still have no idea how that happened. Another evening, I was sitting on the couch watching television when I heard music coming from somewhere else in the apartment. I paused the show and followed the sound into my bedroom. My smart speaker was playing Dreams by Fleetwood Mac. I asked, "Why are you playing that?" The speaker replied, "Because you asked me to." I told it, "No, I definitely did not." It apologized and stopped the song. That could easily have been another glitch, except I had been humming that exact song for several days. It had been stuck in my head, and I'd been singing it while cooking, cleaning, and walking around the apartment. Maybe the speaker heard me and misunderstood. Still, the timing felt strangely personal. Then there was the knock. One afternoon, someone knocked firmly on my front door. It wasn't a soft tap. It was loud enough to make my dog lose her mind. I quickly put her in her crate and went to answer. Only a few seconds had passed, but when I opened the door, nobody was there. There was no delivery, no note, no footsteps. I checked both directions along the walkway, but I didn't see anyone leaving. Maybe it was a child playing a prank. Maybe someone knocked on the wrong apartment and hurried away. Or maybe my invisible roommate wanted my attention. Things became even stranger when animals started appearing inside. A couple of weeks ago, I walked in from the porch and found a snake stretched across the floor near the fireplace. I panicked, grabbed my dog, and immediately went back outside. By the time someone arrived to help me, the snake had disappeared. We searched everywhere but couldn't find it. I had left the porch door open, so I'm hoping it simply went back outside. Still, I've been checking corners like a nervous security guard ever since. Then, not long afterward, I came inside and found a small marsh crab sitting in the middle of the living room. To be fair, I live beside a marsh. There may be a tear in the porch screen or a gap somewhere that allows animals to get inside. But why am I suddenly getting surprise visits from creatures that look like they were selected by a haunted house casting department? Why not a butterfly? Why not a harmless little frog? Instead, I get a snake and a crab within a few weeks of each other. I love animals, but I believe we can respect each other from our assigned territories. The moment that bothered me most happened after I returned from a 7-day trip. I was getting ready to shower and reached for a towel hanging on the rack. The moment I touched it, I realized it was wet. Not slightly damp from humidity. Wet as though someone had just used it after a shower. But I had been away for an entire week. No one was supposed to have been inside my apartment. A few nights later, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. I sometimes hear noises from the apartments beside me or above me, but this sounded as though it came from inside my own kitchen. I checked every cabinet and every counter. Nothing had fallen. Then today, something happened right in front of me. I have a small framed illustration sitting on a bookcase. It shows a woman in a yellow coat standing beside a fox. The picture sits in the center of the shelf, with a basket of cables on one side and a carved wooden bird on the other. Nothing was touching it. While I was standing there, I watched the picture suddenly fly forward and land on the floor. It didn't slowly slide. It didn't wobble and tip over. It came off the shelf with enough force that it looked as though someone had pushed it. I stood there staring at it for a moment, trying to understand what I had just seen. Eventually, I picked it up, placed it back on the shelf, and spoke out loud. I said, "If someone is here, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. I'm paying attention, but I'm not receiving the message. I don't mind sharing this space as long as you don't intend to hurt me, my dog, or damage my things. But please stop throwing things around." And that's where I am now. I don't know whether I'm dealing with an unusual series of ordinary events, an old building full of vibrations and technical glitches, or something I can't explain. Maybe every incident has its own perfectly reasonable cause. Maybe the bottles slipped. Maybe the plants were caught in the blinds. Maybe the speaker misunderstood my singing. Maybe someone knocked and walked away. Maybe the animals found a hole in the porch. But when I think about all of it together, I can't help wondering whether something is trying to make itself known. And if it is, what am I supposed to do? Should I cleanse the apartment? Keep talking to it calmly? Ignore it completely? Try the spirit board again, even though I'm not sure that's a door I want to open. I'm not frightened exactly, but I am curious, cautious, and slightly tired of finding unexpected guests and flying decorations in my living room. Whatever is here, natural or otherwise, I just hope it understands one thing. It can stay peaceful, or it can start contributing to the rent. I've experienced strange things for as long as I can remember. Paranormal stories were almost normal in my family, even though nobody really liked talking about them for too long. On my dad's side, my grandmother was known as a spiritual healer. People would come to her for prayers, cleansings, and help with things they couldn't explain. My dad had his own frightening encounters growing up, including seeing shadowy figures moving through rooms when nobody else was awake. My mom's side of the family is deeply religious. My mom has always had vivid, disturbing dreams that sometimes keep her awake for hours. When I was younger, I went through something similar. I would wake up terrified, sometimes because of a dream, and sometimes because I thought I heard someone whispering near my bed. Eventually, I became so afraid of sleeping alone that I started staying in my older sister's room. Before that, she had never experienced anything unusual. But whenever I slept in her room, she would sometimes wake up hearing a voice in the darkness. It only happened when I was there, which made me wonder whether whatever followed me into that room was somehow connected to me. The stories in our family went back even further, to the first house we lived in. I was too young to remember much of it, so most of what I know came from my parents and siblings. My dad saw dark figures passing through the hallway. My older brother once saw a young girl standing inside the house and assumed she was one of his sisters, until he realized none of us were there. My mom and sister both heard a woman scream from somewhere inside the house, even though they were alone. And when my sister was little, she once felt something moving behind her pillow. When she turned around, she saw what looked like a hand slowly pressing against the fabric. Years later, we moved into another home, and that was where I began having experiences of my own. Most of them were small things: shadows, strange sounds, the feeling of being watched. Because I had grown up hearing these stories, I didn't react to them the way most people probably would. But there was one night that changed that. My sister and I were teenagers. It was sometime in late 2019, and we were sitting in the living room watching a crime show. I still remember the scene. One of the investigators was questioning a woman and asking her to repeat a series of actions. Our little dog started barking from the dining room. We ignored him because he barked at everything. A car outside, a noise from the neighbors, sometimes absolutely nothing. Then our larger dog began barking. That immediately got our attention. He was a protective dog, but he was calm unless he believed something was genuinely wrong. My sister and I looked at each other, and before either of us could speak, we heard him, running from the dining room into the kitchen. The kitchen was partly hidden from where we were sitting. A narrow passage connected it to the living room, and we could see the entrance, but not the entire room. That was where we saw our dog backing out of the kitchen. He wasn't turning around. He was walking backward, staring at something we couldn't see. Then he suddenly yelped and jumped sideways. I had heard him make that sound only once before, when someone accidentally stepped on his paw. It sounded like he had been struck. My fear turned into anger almost instantly. My sister and I jumped from the couch. She grabbed the larger dog by his collar, and I picked up the smaller one. Neither of us wanted to look directly into the kitchen. Our big dog kept pulling toward it, growling and barking as though someone was standing there. My sister had to use both hands to hold him back. The television was still playing. The dogs were making noise, and we were talking over each other, trying to decide what to do. Then my sister suddenly said, "Wait, be quiet." I paused the television. The room went still. Our dog lowered his head and began growling again. And then we heard the footsteps. They were slow and heavy, like someone wearing thick work boots. One step, then another, then another. The strangest part was the sound of the floor. Earlier that day, something had spilled in the kitchen, so parts of the tile were slightly sticky. Whenever we walked across it, our shoes made a faint pulling sound. These footsteps made that same sound. It didn't sound distant or muffled. It sounded like a real person was walking across our kitchen floor. My sister leaned toward me and whispered, "What if someone broke in?" We both wanted that to be true. An intruder was terrifying, but at least an intruder would make sense. Still, every door was locked. The dogs had been in the dining room. Nobody could have entered without us hearing something. The footsteps stopped. The atmosphere in the room changed. I don't know how else to explain it. The air felt heavier, and I suddenly had the overwhelming sense that someone was standing just beyond the wall. It didn't feel human. For some reason, I pictured an older man. I couldn't see him, but that was the feeling I got. Something masculine, cold, and angry. My sister grabbed a Bible from the table and began reading aloud. She tried to pray the way our mother did, with a firm and confident voice, but both of us were shaking. As she prayed, I began feeling exhausted. Not normal tiredness. It felt like the strength was being pulled out of me. When my sister's voice weakened, I took over and continued reading. I tried to sound brave, but my words came out quietly. My chest felt tight, and I had to fight the urge to panic. The presence didn't leave. Then the footsteps started again. At the same time, dishes in the sink began clinking together. We heard movement from the second floor, followed by another heavy step in the kitchen. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. I looked at my sister and whispered, "It's coming toward us." Step by step, it crossed the kitchen. Then it stopped directly behind the wall that blocked our view. It was only a few feet away. That was the moment I felt something I'll never forget. It felt amused. Not happy exactly, more like it was enjoying our fear. I felt as though it knew we were terrified and wanted us to understand that our prayers weren't frightening it. Before I realized what was happening, my sister and I were both on our knees. My entire body felt weak. My sister told me to call our parents while she kept praying. My mom answered, and I tried to explain what was happening without crying. My sister turned on worship music and raised the volume. I stayed on the phone while my parents prayed with us. Then, almost as suddenly as it had arrived, the heaviness disappeared. The dogs stopped pulling toward the kitchen. The house felt empty again. When our parents arrived, my sister and I ran outside without looking back. My dad walked straight into the kitchen, striking the walls with the palm of his hand and shouting for anything inside the house to leave. My mom followed behind him, praying through every room. Nothing else happened that night, but the fear stayed with us. About a week later, our dad came home from work and walked upstairs wearing his heavy boots. The sound was almost identical. My sister and I both froze. For a moment, neither of us could breathe. We were right back in that living room, listening to those footsteps coming closer. But there's one more part of the story that still bothers me. 2 nights before the incident, I had a dream. In the dream, my sister and I were kneeling together in a dark place filled with fog. We were holding hands and praying. A large shadow was walking toward us. I couldn't see its face or upper body clearly. I could only see its legs and the heavy boots it was wearing. I remember closing my eyes, then opening them slightly to see whether it was still approaching. It kept coming closer until it stopped directly in front of us. Then I woke up. At the time, I didn't think much about it, but after what happened in the kitchen, I couldn't stop thinking about how closely the dream matched that night. The boots, the footsteps, my sister and me kneeling together and praying. I still don't understand why it happened. I don't know what that presence was, why it seemed to target us, or why I could sense so clearly that it felt like an older man. I don't understand why it seemed to mock us, or why I dreamed about it before it appeared. Since then, I've had other strange experiences, but nothing has ever felt as physical or as threatening as those footsteps. We live in a different house now, and for the most part, it has been peaceful. There was one unexplained incident outside, but that's a story for another time. Sometimes I still wonder whether my sister and I would believe that night happened if we hadn't experienced it together. Had I been alone, I might have convinced myself it was the television, the pipes, the dogs, or my imagination. But my sister heard it too. She felt the same heaviness. She watched the dogs react to something neither of us could see. Whatever walked through that kitchen felt real. And even after all these years, I can still hear those slow, sticky footsteps moving toward us in the dark. Hey, I want to share a story with you that's been sitting quietly in my mind for years. It's from back in 2016, when I was about 13, living in this small suburban town in Pennsylvania. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the streets are lined with tall, whispering trees. I lived up on this steep hill overlooking the town, which felt like its own little world. Across the street lived my neighbor. Let's call her Annie. She was a grade below me, 12 years old, and we weren't super close but had this quiet friendship. Now, around this time, Annie had just lost her grandmother, and it was really hard on her. I didn't have much experience with loss back then. My family was distant, and I hadn't felt that kind of sadness firsthand. But I could see it in Annie. When she came back home after spending a few days with her family, she was a mess. Eyes red, shoulders slumped, carrying this heavy weight I couldn't just fix with words. So I did the only thing I knew. I found her and wrapped my arms around her in a hug. It felt like the right thing to do. After that, we decided to hang out for the night. Annie's older brother was at a friend's house trying to cope in his own way, so we had his room to ourselves. He'd graciously given us permission to use his queen-size bed, perfect for 2, and we settled in. We spent the evening doing all the typical stuff, chatting about silly things, sharing secrets, laughing at inside jokes, the usual tween girl stuff I won't bore you with. But that night, something strange happened. Around midnight, we were watching episodes of South Park on Annie's laptop. She started to drift off during the last episode, her breathing slowing, eyes fluttering shut. I finished the episode quietly, careful not to wake her, then set the laptop down on the floor and turned over to sleep myself. I thought everything was normal, but then the night started to twist in a way that's hard to explain. Let me take you through the timeline because the details matter. Around 12:30 a.m., Annie stirred, not just a little, but noticeably, like she was unsettled. By 1 a.m., it was more intense. She was tossing and turning, making these odd noises, like when a baby tries to talk but can't quite form words. Those soft, confused sounds caught somewhere between a mumble and a growl. It was unsettling. By 1:30, she'd shifted in such a strange way that her head was at my feet and her feet at my head. The noises grew louder, more guttural, definitely not her usual sleepy murmurs. I started feeling uneasy, watching her so intently. Time ticked on to 2 a.m., and she was still stirring, still making those noises. Then, around 2:30, things took a turn that I can't shake from my memory. Annie suddenly sat up in bed, completely straight, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond me. Her body relaxed in this eerie way, as if she was letting go of control. Then, in this soft, almost scared voice, she said, "But I didn't mean to." It sounded like she was being scolded by someone, or something. Then she swung her legs out and laid back down perfectly still, like a doll being placed carefully on a shelf. I was frozen, heart pounding, unsure whether to wake her or run. Then I looked in the direction she was staring at. For just a split second, I saw it. A figure of a woman, glowing pure white, featureless, but undeniably there. It wasn't near a window or mirror, and the streetlights outside cast a warm yellow glow, not that cold white light that would explain it away. The presence was brief, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. At exactly 2:37 a.m., I remember the time because my mind was racing. I packed up quietly and left Annie's house. Walking home down that dark street beneath the whispering trees, I felt like eyes were on me from every shadow. I kept glancing behind, but there was nothing, just the empty night. Yet, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The concrete path leading up to my front door suddenly felt like a gauntlet. Then, I heard it. Heavy footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like someone in boots walking close, matching my pace. I stopped, trying to convince myself it was just my own steps echoing. But when I started moving faster, so did the footsteps. Right as I reached my door, the sounds faded away into silence. The next day, I told Annie what I'd seen, hoping she might understand. She didn't have an explanation, but weeks later, when I brought it up again, she looked at me with this quiet knowing and said, "Oh, that was my grandma. She visits me in my sleep now." It gave me chills, but also a strange comfort. Now, about that feeling of being watched, it connects to where we lived. Pennsylvania has a deep history with coal mining, and beneath our houses, including mine, lie old mining tunnels, abandoned and unstable. The risk of collapse was real, and stories whispered about accidents and illnesses that had happened long ago. Maybe that night, whatever I saw was more than a ghost. Maybe it was a guardian of sorts, watching over me as I walked home, making sure I was safe. Since that night, I've never experienced anything like it again. I'm now 20, and Annie and I have drifted apart. It feels like a strange, unfinished chapter in my life, a mystery wrapped in the quiet of a long-ago midnight. But sometimes, when the night is still and the shadows stretch long, I remember that glowing white figure and the soft, scared voice saying, "But I didn't mean to." And I wonder what messages are left unspoken, lingering just out of sight on that hill where we lived. Hey there, I want to share a story that's been on my mind. A real-life mystery that's both haunting and heartbreaking. It's about the Jameson family from Eufaula, Oklahoma. Now, this family, Bobby Jameson, his wife Sherilyn, and their daughter Maddie, seemed like they had their share of struggles, but also moments of hope. Bobby was 44, Sherilyn was 39, and Maddie was 6 years old, full of that innocent energy you'd expect from a little girl her age. Life wasn't easy for them. Bobby dealt with chronic back pain that weighed heavily on him every day. Sherilyn struggled with bipolar disorder, and unfortunately, she often slipped into deep depression, especially when she missed her medications. You could tell the house they lived in carried a strange atmosphere, not just because of their struggles, but something more unsettling. Bobby was convinced their home was haunted by spirits living on the roof. I can only imagine the kind of fear and tension that must have caused. He even called their pastor Gary multiple times, asking where he could get special bullets to shoot at these supposed spirits. It's a chilling image, isn't it? Adding to that eerie vibe, Sherilyn painted creepy words on their storage container that sat outside. Neighbors kept their distance, avoiding the family whenever possible because of that unsettling presence. It's easy to see how isolation and fear fed into their everyday lives. One day, tired of the bad energy and hoping for a fresh start, the Jamesons decided to leave their old house behind. But instead of moving into a new home, they chose to buy a plot of land in Red Oak and build a new house from scratch. Until then, they planned to live in that same storage container they had painted, an odd choice, but one that made sense to them. So, on October 8, 2009, they packed up their truck, took their beloved dog Maisie, and set out for their new land. It was the last time anyone saw them alive. Now, the Jamesons were no strangers to disappearing for days at a time to escape the noise of city life. So when they didn't check in, their friends and family didn't panic immediately. They'd even told Maddie's school about the move, so her absence from class didn't raise alarms. But then, on October 16th, two hunters stumbled upon their truck parked in a clearing in the Panola Mountains. Finding a vehicle out here was rare, so they approached with curiosity, hoping to find the owners. What they found was chilling. The truck was locked up tight, windows rolled up, and inside was Maisie, their dog, exhausted and alone. No sign of the family anywhere. The hunters called the police, who arrived and carefully broke a window to rescue Maisie, who seemed close to passing out from being trapped so long. Inside the truck, they found Bobby's wallet, Sherilyn's purse, their IDs, phones, a GPS device, and a bank bag stuffed with $32,000 in cash. Among those items was an 11-page letter Sherilyn had written to Bobby. It was filled with anger, accusing him of being a recluse. You can almost feel the weight of those words, the frustration and pain behind them. The police searched the area but found no sign of the Jamesons. Using the GPS from their phones, they learned the family had gone up a nearby hill, stayed for about 15 minutes, then returned to the truck. When officers climbed the hill, they found only Maddie's footprints. No trace of Bobby or Sherilyn. That struck a nerve. What happened to the parents? Digging deeper into the phones, they found a recent photo of Maddie, taken at the hilltop. Her face looked unhappy, almost scared. It was clear the family had been there together. This led to a massive search involving over 400 volunteers scouring the area, but no new clues appeared. The footage from their home surveillance added another layer of mystery. It showed Bobby and Sherilyn loading the truck before they left, but they moved almost like they were in a trance, walking back and forth, sometimes with nothing in their hands, silent, occasionally staring off into the distance. It was eerie and unsettling. Years passed with no answers, until November 2013, when two hunters found 3 skeletons lying face down side by side in a remote part of the Panola Mountains, about 5 kilometers from where the truck had been found. 2 adults and a child, almost certainly the Jameson family. Forensics confirmed the identities almost 8 months later, but the cause of death remained a mystery. The skeletons had deteriorated too much to tell. Bobby's skull bore a small hole in the back, and there were tiny holes on other bones, but nothing conclusive. So many questions hung in the air. People started speculating about what could have happened. One theory suggested the family got lost in the woods and died trying to find their way out. But the weather was fairly mild during that time, nights not dropping below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the rain wasn't severe enough to cause fatal conditions. It seemed unlikely, but not impossible. Another theory pointed to a tragic murder-suicide. Sherilyn's bipolar disorder and the hateful letter she wrote suggested she might have harmed her family in a moment of mania. Yet friends insisted Sherilyn would never hurt Maddie, and since they were excited about building a new home, this scenario felt off. Some wondered if Bobby's strained relationship with his father had a darker role. Bobby had previously sought a protective order against his dad, who had threatened them. But when the family disappeared, Bobby's father was hospitalized and died 2 months later, making it improbable he was involved. Then there was a mysterious phone call received by Sherilyn's friend Nikki after the bodies were found. A woman claiming to have been in a white supremacist cult called, saying the Jamesons were once on their hit list before the call abruptly ended and couldn't be traced. Adding to the mystery, a satanic Bible was found in their home, and the large sum of cash in their truck suggested they might have been lured into something dangerous. The Jameson family's disappearance and death remain an unsolved enigma, an echo in the mountains that refuses to fade. Their story is a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be, and how some mysteries, no matter how hard we try, might never fully be unraveled. Hey, I want to share with you 2 chilling stories that have haunted communities for decades. Tales of mysterious disappearances, ghostly apparitions, and the unsettling shadows cast over ordinary lives. Let me take you back first to a quiet neighborhood in West Des Moines, Iowa, back in 1982, and then across the ocean to a small English town called Hammersmith in the early 1800s. Let's begin with the story of a young boy named Johnny Gossman. He was born in November 1969 and was the only son of John and Nora Gossman, a loving couple who doted on him. Now, Johnny was just 12 years old when, on a crisp September morning in 1982, he set out around 5:45 a.m. to deliver the Sunday papers for the local Des Moines Register. Normally, Johnny would wake his father up to accompany him on his delivery route, but on this particular day, he left alone, with only Gretel, their tiny dachshund, trotting alongside him. Johnny wore his usual white sweatshirt, emblazoned with the words Kim's Academy on the back, paired with sweatpants and those bright blue rubber flip-flops he liked so much. In his hands was a yellow paper sack, and he pulled along his trusty red wagon, the one he used to carry his bundle of newspapers. But that morning, something was off. Johnny never made it to deliver the papers. Around 7 a.m., his mother, Nora, received a call from a neighbor, upset about not getting their paper. John's heart sank as he stepped outside to investigate. Just 2 blocks away, he found Johnny's red wagon, still loaded with newspapers, and Gretel sitting quietly nearby. It was as if Johnny had simply vanished into thin air. Frantic, John and Nora called the police. But back then, the rules were harsh. The police wouldn't officially list Johnny as missing until 72 hours had passed. Imagine that agonizing wait, their minds racing, hearts pounding, as precious time slipped away. The police initially thought Johnny might have run away, but his parents knew better. Their son would never just disappear. They suspected kidnapping but had no clear leads. So, they began their own search, talking to witnesses and piecing together what little information they could find. One of Johnny's fellow paperboys, Mike, remembered seeing a blue Ford Fairmont car pull up near where Johnny was getting his papers. The engine switched off and the driver stepped out, his feet resting casually on the car's running board. Mike overheard him ask Johnny for directions to 86th Street. Johnny's reply was confused and didn't make sense. "My papers are in the wagon," he said, adding with a hint of fear. "I'm scared. I'm getting out of here. I'm heading home." As Johnny turned to leave, the car's headlights flashed 3 quick signals, a strange, deliberate pattern. Then, A tall man emerged from the shadows between two buildings and began to follow Johnny down 42nd Street toward Marcourt Lane. It was a moment heavy with dread, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Elsewhere in town, a man named Mr. Smith was awoken by the sharp slam of a car door. Peering through his window, he saw a black and silver car speed through a stop sign and make a sharp left. Other neighbors also reported seeing Johnny talking to a strange man in a blue car with license plates from Warren County. Despite the frantic efforts, police found no sign of Johnny. It was as if he had simply been erased from existence. The officer in charge declared that Johnny had just vanished. Unwilling to accept this grim conclusion, Nora enlisted the help of two private investigators, Jim and Ted, who pursued leads the police ignored. What they uncovered was horrifying. Whispers of Johnny being kidnapped into a global pedophile and prostitution ring. In March 1983, 6 months after Johnny disappeared, a woman in Oklahoma told a harrowing story. She said a young boy approached her in a parking lot, screaming, "I'm Johnny Gossman. I've been kidnapped." Before she could help, two men grabbed the boy and disappeared into the night. Years passed, with more eerie signs. The Gossmans received a dollar bill with a handwritten note. "I am alive, Johnny Gossman." Nora recognized the handwriting immediately. In Denver, scrawled on a bathroom wall in a diner, someone wrote, "Johnny Gossman was here." Whether these were cries for help or cruel hoaxes, no one could say. Then, tragedy struck again. Another paperboy, Eugene, vanished on August 12, 1984, while delivering papers in a different part of Des Moines. Police insisted the cases were unrelated, but Nora believed otherwise. Months before Eugene disappeared, a private investigator had warned her of another kidnapping, this time targeting a boy from the south side of town during the second weekend of August. Eugene's family reached out to a local dairy company, who agreed to place photos and details of both boys on milk cartons to spread awareness. Despite the wide reach, no new leads surfaced. Years later, in 1989, Nora met Paul, a 21-year-old who claimed to have been trapped in the same prostitution ring as Johnny. Paul spoke of Lawrence E. King Jr., a powerful Republican businessman, and alleged high-ranking politicians involved in a cult practicing unspeakable horrors, mutilation, sacrifice, even cannibalism. Paul said he had met Johnny in captivity and described a scar on Johnny's tongue. Information never made public. The FBI and police dismissed Paul's story without investigation, calling the entire ring a hoax, likely due to the influential names implicated. But Nora held on to hope, convinced that her son's story was real. Then, in the quiet hours of March 1997, Nora's world turned upside down again. Two young men knocked on her apartment door in Iowa. Peering out, she saw unfamiliar faces. One spoke, "It's me, Johnny. Can I come in?" Her heart raced as she let them inside. The young man, her son, grown into adulthood, revealed a distinctive birthmark on his chest, confirming his identity. He told her he had escaped the clutches of the pedophile ring and was hiding to stay safe. He warned her that he was still in danger and could not risk visiting again. Before leaving, he begged his mother to bring his captors to justice. Nora reported this encounter to the FBI, who created a sketch of Johnny as a young man. But without concrete evidence, doubt lingered. Was this truly Johnny? Was it a ghost of hope, a trick of grief, or a cruel prank? The truth remained elusive. Then, in 2006, another chilling twist. Nora found an envelope on her doorstep containing 3 photographs. Each showed young boys tied and gagged, one of whom looked unmistakably like Johnny. She took the photos to the police, but they dismissed them as a prank, identifying the boys as willing participants in earlier photographs unrelated to Johnny. Despite Nora's unwavering belief, the police refused to take action, leaving the mystery of Johnny Gossman's fate unresolved. Now, Let's journey to Hammersmith, England, December 1803. A small town nestled along the northern bank of the River Thames was gripped by terror. Not from a person, but something inexplicable. Residents whispered of a ghostly figure haunting the lanes, churchyards, and fields, a phantom cloaked in white, sometimes described as a beast-like apparition. The fear it spread was so profound that locals refused to leave their homes after sunset. One cold night, December 15th, Thomas Groom, a servant at a local brewery, was walking through St. Paul's churchyard with a companion. Around 9 p.m., a chilling encounter unfolded. Thomas suddenly felt a hand grab his throat, pulling him around. Though he saw nothing, he felt the touch of a heavy greatcoat. He fought back, pushing at the unseen assailant, but this terrifying assault left him bedridden with a high fever for days. Later that month, William Girdler, the town's watchman, reported seeing a tall, white figure during his patrol. As he approached, he realized it was a man draped in a white cloth, wearing a dark coat with shiny buttons beneath. When William tried to apprehend him, the figure vanished into the night. The ghostly attacks continued, taking a deadly toll. In early January 1804, two women, one elderly, the other pregnant, were so frightened by their encounters that they died from shock. A coach driver, traveling alone down a lonely lane, heard rustling and spotted a white figure gliding alongside his carriage. This apparition had bladders tied to different parts of its body, an eerie sight that sent the driver fleeing into town, leaving passengers and horses behind. In response, the community, desperate for peace, offered a reward for capturing the ghost. Armed groups of young men, including a 29-year-old excise officer named Francis Smythe, took to the streets at night, guns in hand. On January 3, 1804, Smythe set out on his ghost hunt. Meeting William Girdler briefly, he announced his mission before disappearing into the darkness. Meanwhile, a bricklayer named Thomas Millwood, dressed in his white work clothes, was returning home. Mistaken for the ghost by Smythe, who was tense and on edge, Thomas was tragically shot through the jaw. He died from his wound, and his body was taken to the Black Lion Inn. Francis Smythe admitted to the shooting, claiming he thought he was defending the town from the ghost. Despite this, he was sentenced to death on January 6, 1804. But just weeks later, on January 24, the king pardoned him on the condition Smythe serve a year in prison. As the trial unfolded, another piece of the puzzle emerged. John Graham, a local shoemaker and chapel singer, confessed to dressing as the ghost, not out of malice, but to teach his apprentices a lesson after they scared his children with ghost stories. Graham maintained he only donned the costume once, a claim accepted by the community. With this revelation, the ghost sightings ceased, and life in Hammersmith slowly returned to normal. But the ghost wasn't done. 2 decades later, in December 1824, reports of a new ghost spread through the town. This figure, tall and white, targeted women, disappearing mysteriously after appearances. One young woman, chased after work, suffered terrifying fits from the fear. A man, attacked and thrown to the ground, was left with a broken arm. Another woman was found unconscious, her clothes torn and her body scratched deeply. On February 15, 1825, the ghost was finally unmasked. A man named Worsley caught the apparition. It was Farmer John Benson, a prankster playing ghost to frighten townsfolk. After his capture, the ghost sightings stopped once more. Yet, not all believed these were mere costumes. A newspaper article in 1955 recounted an old local legend. In 1803, a man had slit his own throat beside the church and was buried in the churchyard. Some believed the ghost haunting Hammersmith was his restless spirit, rising from the grave every 50 years on the first full moon of August. Paranormal investigator Chris Farnham and a team of 17 others claimed to witness a white, legless figure hovering above the grave on August 5, 1955. the ghost drifted silently around the churchyard before vanishing back into the tomb. So, were these ghosts just men in white sheets, or something more? The stories blur the line between fear, folklore, and the unknown. Both tales remind us that sometimes the veil between reality and mystery is thin, and the search for truth can be as haunting as the shadows themselves. Hey there, I want to share a story that's been on my mind for a while now. It's about a young woman named Irina Cornici and the tragic events that unfolded at a remote monastery in eastern Romania back in 2005. It's a story filled with hope, fear, and heartbreak. And I want you to hear it as if I'm sitting right beside you, telling you everything in detail. So picture this. It's the morning of June 15th, 2005, in a small, quiet village called Tenaku, surrounded by rolling hills and thick forests. The Holy Trinity Monastery stands there, almost isolated, a place that promises peace, but hides a dark story. A team of paramedics rushes there because someone needs help. When they arrive, they find a young woman, Irina, lying motionless, dressed like a nun, strapped to a makeshift wooden cross. At first, they don't know the full story. Irina was just 23 years old. She had been through something unimaginable. A 3-day exorcism led by Father Daniel Petre Korojan, the monastery's abbot. Alongside him were 4 devoted nuns, all trying desperately to rid her of what they believed was a demon possessing her. But Irina's struggle was much deeper than anyone realized. Let me take you back to where it all began. Irina was born in 1981 to a poor, unmarried couple in Vaslui County. When she was just 3, she faced a trauma that no child should ever endure. Her father, a troubled man with a violent streak, took his own life by hanging himself inside their home. After that, her mother was judged unfit to care for Irina and her siblings. So, Irina and her little brother Vasile ended up in a state-run orphanage, a place riddled with corruption and cruelty. The caregivers, the very people meant to protect these children, inflicted terrible abuse. Despite all this, Irina grew up tough. She was a survivor, like many girls from those orphanages. She learned self-defense early on and fell in love with karate, which became her shield and her strength. She had a deep, commanding voice and preferred to wear sports clothes rather than anything frilly or soft. Her education was limited, and so, at 19, she left Romania to work as a nanny in Germany. Even then, she stayed close to her brother and her best friend from the orphanage, Paraskiva. Paraskiva had found a new path. In 2003, she joined the order at the Holy Trinity Monastery and wrote to Irina about the peace she'd found there. She spoke of Father Korojan, a man she trusted deeply, who helped her carry her burdens. Paraskiva invited Irina to come for confession and Holy Communion, promising that it would bring her the relief she craved. So, in early April 2005, Irina and Vasile visited the monastery. For Father Korojan, their arrival was a blessing. The monastery was still unfinished, and he welcomed their help. But there's more to Father Korojan's story too. Before becoming a priest, he was studying theology at Jaki University, but his ordination was rushed, done before he even graduated, which raised eyebrows. The Orthodox Church allows priests to perform exorcisms without needing approval from higher-ups, so exorcisms were not uncommon in this region. Father Korojan, inspired by other priests, began performing his own exorcisms at the monastery. Back to Irina. She was thrilled to be with her friend, attending services, doing chores, and slowly thinking about making the monastery her home. Little did she know, the calm was just the beginning. On April 8th, pushed gently by Paraskiva, Irina made her confession to Father Korojan. He started by asking about her life in Germany, trying to ease her into it. But as the conversation went deeper, she became visibly distressed, retreating inward. Sensing her pain, Father Korogian advised her to leave Germany and settle closer to the monastery. He gave her a blessing and assigned penance to complete before her Holy Communion the next day. The morning of April 9th, Irina joined the sisters for Mass. She wore a skirt and blouse with a scarf covering her head, clothes she didn't feel comfortable in, but the excitement of the communion kept her spirits up. After receiving communion, she felt different, lighter somehow. She wandered the monastery grounds, humming a song that seemed to fill her soul. But that evening, things took a turn. As the nuns began beating the sementron, a wooden percussion instrument used to call the faithful to prayer, the rhythm pulled Irina toward the church. At first, it felt mystical, like a call she couldn't resist. But suddenly, dread overwhelmed her. The skirt she wore felt suffocating, and she turned back to change into her usual clothes. On her way, she snapped at some nuns who asked for help, a sharpness in her voice that wasn't her own. Sister Nicoletta, the Mother Superior, tried to calm her, but Irina just mumbled and walked away. Then, in a moment that shocked everyone, Irina snuck behind Sister Nicoletta and made rude gestures and obscene remarks. The Mother Superior, stunned, called for Paraskeva. At the sight of her friend, Irina bolted. After prayers, she returned, now in jeans, hopping behind the sisters, mocking their movements and shouting profanities. Paraskeva later described something unrecognizable in Irina, someone entirely changed, reacting violently every time she heard the name of Jesus. Father Korogian was deeply concerned. He thought Irina must have hidden something during her first confession, something that compromised her communion. So he asked Paraskeva to bring her back for a second confession. What happened next was unusual. Paraskeva confessed on Irina's behalf, revealing her traumatic past, mimicking her mannerisms as she did. After this, Irina's condition worsened dramatically. She fell to the ground, squirming, yelling one moment that she wanted to leave, the next begging to stay. She became reckless, hurting herself. Father Korogian and Sister Nicoletta called an ambulance, but got no immediate response. So they tied her up with a rope and took her to the county hospital. Doctors diagnosed her with a psychotic episode, labeling it delusional hallucinatory flush, and later disorganized schizophrenia. Diagnoses that seemed more about managing medication than understanding her real pain. Despite treatment, including sedation, Irina's health declined, and she was moved to intensive care. 12 days later, deemed recovered, she was released back to the monastery. But the voices, those demonic voices she complained about, never stopped. At the monastery, Sister Nicoletta saw Irina rocking at the edge of her bed, singing and screaming while staring at an empty wall, a presence so chilling it sent shivers down her spine. Irina made a third confession, and for a while it seemed to help. She returned to her usual self, and everyone felt hopeful. Father Korogian told her they could care for her at the monastery, but needed her savings to provide medication and accommodation. She gave it, but soon after, her tantrums returned. She cursed the nuns, threatened them with karate moves, and grew violent. Father Korogian had to restrain her, tied her up, gagged her, and confined her to her room for 2 days. During this time, she screamed in terror, claiming the devil was coming for her. That's when Father Korogian decided on the exorcism. The nuns made a cross on the spot, chained Irina to it, taped her mouth, and brought her to the church. Sister Nicoletta later said that if they hadn't chained her, she might have killed herself or someone else. Another sister claimed Irina herself asked to be tied up, knowing she was possessed and wanting help. The ritual was intense. Father Korogian tried to give her holy water and blessed bread, but she refused, which only confirmed his belief that she was demon-possessed. Hours of struggle followed, repeated over 2 more days and nights. Irina was carried to the church's enclosed veranda, still tied to the cross, placed on a quilt. Finally, On the morning of June 15th, after 3 grueling days, Father Coragen declared her cured and untied her. But Irina was barely alive, too weak to stand, her mouth raw and wounded, her body dehydrated. The nuns tried to feed her bread soaked in warm tea, but she soon became unresponsive. Paramedics were called. When they arrived about 30 minutes later, they found her lifeless. Despite the nuns' claims that they had fed her only an hour before, the medics believed she had died hours prior. They rushed to the hospital, attempting resuscitation with adrenaline injections, but it was too late. Doctors said she looked decades older, worn down by suffering and dehydration. Her death sparked an investigation. Father Coragen and the 4 nuns involved were charged with murder. They insisted Irina died from the adrenaline overdose during transport. Father Coragen was sentenced to 14 years, later reduced to 7, and defrocked. The nuns served between 5 and 8 years and were dismissed from their duties. Some say Irina was mentally ill, trapped in a battle with schizophrenia. Others, including her brother, believe she was truly possessed and that Father Coragen tried to save her. So, was it a fight against a demon, a mental illness, or both intertwined in tragedy? I guess that's for each of us to decide. Thanks for listening to Irina's story. It's a haunting reminder of how fragile and complex the human soul can be. I'm reaching out because I'm trying to find someone in the western North Carolina foothills who may be able to help me understand and remove what feels like some kind of attachment. I've experienced unusual things a few times before. The first episode eventually faded on its own and stayed gone for several years. I don't know whether what I'm dealing with now is the same thing returning or something entirely different. The next time it happened, I received some help that didn't seem to make much difference. Shortly afterward, though, someone else helped me, and within a week or two, most of the activity seemed to stop. Every now and then, I would still get a strange sensation or notice a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, even when there was no obvious shadow, branch, or reflection that could explain it. Lately, it feels like everything is building up again. I'm not exactly frightened. Honestly, I'm mostly exhausted and frustrated. It's wearing down my patience, affecting my mood, and leaving me tired almost all the time. I sometimes physically feel as though something has connected to me or is interfering with my body. I realize how that sounds. Some people may immediately assume I'm imagining things or that I've lost touch with reality. All I can say is that I consider myself a fairly ordinary, grounded person. I work, pay my bills, spend time with my family, and usually relax at home in the evenings. My life probably looks uneventful from the outside. I may be more emotionally or spiritually sensitive than some people, but I'm not someone who is constantly chasing paranormal experiences. I'm older now, and my days of running from place to place are mostly behind me. I've had a stable life, a loving family, and no major trauma or injury that I can connect to what's happening. This latest episode began shortly after I started renovating an abandoned farmhouse that was well over a century old. I can't prove that the job had anything to do with it, but the timing has always stood out to me. Nothing else unusual happened around that period that might explain why everything suddenly started again. I had already been living in my current home for nearly 2 years. It's also an older house, and neighbors have told me that at least one former resident passed away there. Despite that history, I hadn't noticed anything unusual in the home until a few days after beginning the renovation project. The first thing I noticed was my bed vibrating at night. It was subtle, but strong enough that I could see and feel the mattress moving. I checked for every practical explanation I could think of. There were no appliances, pipes, motors, or equipment operating nearby, either under the floor or above the room. At first, I thought I might be having a muscle spasm. I pulled back the covers and carefully checked myself, but my body wasn't shaking. I sat upright, and the bed continued vibrating beneath me. Without thinking, I said out loud, "Are you seriously shaking my bed right now?" The vibration stopped immediately. After that, it began happening regularly. Most nights I could say, "Please stop shaking the bed. Good night." And it would stop within a few seconds, or occasionally after a minute or two. That arrangement didn't last. Over time, the activity became more intrusive and aggravating. There are no polite good nights anymore. These days, my responses are usually much less friendly. When whatever this is seems to approach or connect with me, I sometimes experience a sudden electrical sensation that begins around my head and spreads through me. The best comparison I can offer is that I feel briefly charged from the inside, almost like a human sparkler. It isn't painful exactly, but it's deeply unpleasant. There have been other strange effects as well. I've discovered a few things that seem to interrupt them temporarily, but nothing has provided lasting relief. I'm fully aware that if someone witnessed me during one of these moments, they might think I looked or sounded completely irrational. I understand that reaction. But living through it feels very different from observing it from the outside. Part of me wants to say, trade places with me for one night and see how you feel. In truth, though, I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone. Not even someone I disliked. So, I'm asking sincerely, is there anyone in the North Carolina foothills who has experience with situations like this and approaches them calmly, respectfully, and responsibly? I'm open to practical explanations, medical guidance, environmental inspections, spiritual support, or any combination of those things. I simply want help from someone trustworthy who won't mock me, frighten me, or make the situation worse. Thank you for listening all the way through. Any genuine guidance would mean more to me than I can express. Whatever blessing speaks to your heart, may it be returned to you. I don't take the service road behind the old grocery building on 10th Avenue South anymore. Not after midnight. Not by myself. And I mean that with my whole chest. This was back in December of '97, one of those Montana nights where the cold felt personal. The river was throwing off steam like something alive was breathing under it. I was working the late shift, stocking shelves at the old store, and I clocked out a little after 2 in the morning. My pickup wouldn't start. The battery was gone. Frozen, dead, useless. I remember standing there with my keys in my hand, just staring at it like disappointment had 4 tires. I didn't want to go back inside and sit under those buzzing break room lights waiting for a tow truck, so I decided I'd walk the back way. Cut behind the building, head toward the college side, then circle home from there. I'd done it before. Plenty of times. That night, I got maybe halfway down that narrow drive behind the loading dock when the big security light overhead burst. Not flickered. Not dimmed. Burst. Glass scattered across the concrete, and the sound of it was so sharp it made my teeth lock together. Then everything went quiet. No cars out on 10th Avenue. No wind. No distant engines. Just my boots breaking the crust of ice under me. And then I saw them. There were 3 figures standing near the old rail spur at the end of the drive. They were tall. Too tall. Taller than the trailers backed up to the dock. 8 feet, maybe more. Thin in a way that didn't look human, like shadows had been stretched until they almost tore. No faces, no clothes. Nothing I could call skin. Just the shape of people cut out of the dark. And their feet weren't touching the ground. They were hanging there, maybe half a foot above the ice, still as fence posts. I couldn't move. I couldn't even get my breath right. Then the one in the middle tilted its head, but not the way a person does. It turned slowly, almost curious, like an animal listening for something under the floorboards. Only it didn't stop. Its head kept going farther and farther until it was completely upside down. And that blank place where a face should have been was aimed right at me. Then it raised one arm. That arm was too long, bent in too many places, and it pointed past me, back toward the store, back toward the lights. I didn't look behind me. Something in me knew not to. I just ran. I ran straight through the parking lot and out onto 10th Avenue South. A truck driver laid on his horn, and I swear he missed me by less than a few feet. I didn't stop until a patrol car found me 2 blocks away, bent over on the sidewalk, trying to breathe. The officer kept asking what happened. All I could say was, they were counting. He said, "Counting what?" And I told him, "The windows. The lights in the windows." They were counting which ones were still on. When they got to mine, it pointed. The police went back there and checked the drive. They didn't find anyone. No tracks in the frost. No marks. Nothing. But every bulb behind that building was blown out. The dock lights, the lot lights, all of them. Glass was scattered everywhere, like they had all popped at the exact same moment. I quit that week. Moved out near Fairfield not long after. Told myself distance would help. Told myself whatever I saw was tied to that building, that old back drive, that miserable hour of the morning. But it wasn't. I work days now. I don't stay out late if I can help it. Still, every few months, right around 2:11 in the morning, my wife wakes up and says she smells something burning. Not smoke exactly. More like old wires getting hot inside a wall. Then she looks out the bedroom window, and there's one of them standing in the field across from our house. 9 feet tall, floating just above the ground. Its head turned all the way upside down, looking at our window, counting. She doesn't wake me anymore. I asked her not to, because I told her the truth. If you look back, it knows someone is home. And then it starts counting your windows. I don't know what happens when it runs out. That's the part I'm afraid of. I'm really sorry you went through that. I know how awful sleep paralysis can feel, because it happened to me once when I was a kid, and for years I honestly thought the fear of it had burned some kind of warning system into my brain, like, never again. For a long time, it really didn't happen again. Almost 20 years passed. Then, a few years back, it started coming around again. Not often, thankfully. Maybe 5 or 6 times total over several years. But every time it happens, it feels just as real and just as heavy. When it starts, I usually wake up right away, but I can't move. And I don't exactly see things with my eyes. It's more like I see them in my mind. Faces, presences, something that feels like it's pressing down on me, holding me there. It doesn't feel like a normal dream. It feels like my imagination has been hijacked by something that doesn't belong there. I've tried all kinds of things to get out of it. I've tried forcing myself to move, but that usually just turns into this weak, twitchy struggle. I've tried calming down and falling back asleep, but the fear makes that impossible. I've tried telling whatever it is to leave me alone, I've even tried getting angry and pushing back with everything I had. None of that really worked. The only thing that has consistently broken it for me is calling on the name of Jesus. And I mean that sincerely. Every time I set my mind on saying his name, it feels like something resists it. Not just fear, not just hesitation. It feels like something is trying to keep me from getting the words out. I can usually speak a little during these episodes, though not clearly. I've managed to say things like, "Let me go," or "I'm not afraid of you," or "You don't get to have me." But none of that ever seemed to change anything. Then I start trying to say Jesus' name, and it's different. It feels blocked at first, like the word has weight to it. But once I finally get it out, the whole thing breaks. The pressure lifts. My body comes back to me. The fear starts draining out of the room. There was one time, though, when it didn't stop immediately. That one scared me more than the others. In my mind, there was this pale, wide-eyed face staring right at me. It had this strange, almost alien look to it, and the presence behind it felt stronger than usual. The first time I said Jesus' name, it didn't fully end, but it weakened enough that I could say it again. And the second time, it was over. Completely gone. That one felt different because after I said his name the first time, whatever it was felt angry, like I had heard it somehow, like it wanted to push back harder because I had dared to call for help. So the second time wasn't brave or bold. It wasn't me trying to sound tough. It was just a scared, honest plea. And still, it worked. I know this is just my experience. I'm not a sleep expert, and I don't claim to have all the answers. I've only had enough of these moments to know what has helped me personally. Some people explain it as the brain getting stuck between sleep and waking, and I understand that. Maybe there's a physical side to it. Maybe there's a neurological explanation for part of it. But for me, it has never felt that simple. What I can say is this: calling on Jesus has been the only thing that has truly helped me in those moments. And if it doesn't seem to work the first time, I'd say keep calling on him. I really hope you find peace, safety, and rest again. I'll keep you in my thoughts, and I genuinely hope things get lighter for you soon. God bless. It wasn't exactly creepy, not in the way people usually mean when they talk about haunted places. It was more like this heavy, irritated energy hanging in the air, like something unseen was constantly pressing on people, nudging them toward anger, arguments, and conflict. I had a lot of friends out there, and I noticed the same pattern again and again. Some people seemed to get pulled into it. Others didn't fully give in. But once that door was open, it was like they were being pushed around by it. And honestly, with Pennsylvania's history, I can understand why the place feels the way it does. There's so much old energy there, and the cemeteries are everywhere. I mean, everywhere. Back in California, cemeteries feel more contained, like they have their own designated spaces. You can drive for half an hour and not see one. But around Allegheny, it felt like you couldn't go 5 minutes without passing one. It gave the whole area this strange, layered feeling, like the past was sitting right there beside you. There are plenty of recorded hauntings in Pennsylvania too, but my own experiences there were overwhelming. I know some people will doubt it or explain it away, and that's fine. But in 2019, after years of dealing with paranormal experiences already, I went through something that changed me. Within about 3 months, I experienced 2 suicides where I had been one of the last people in contact with the person. And if you know anything about certain spiritual beliefs around suicide, people who are extremely close to an event like that, especially if they're already spiritually open, can sometimes attract what some call suicide spirits. These are spirits believed to follow people and try to tempt them toward that same ending. I had several experiences with those kinds of spirits. Over time, they eventually left, but it felt like they left a line of communication open. After that, I started having more encounters, more conversations, more moments where I could feel something trying to come through. At a certain point, when you get deeper into this kind of knowledge, whether people believe it or not, a lot of practitioners agree that human beings can act almost like radios or conduits. Spirits can tune into people and communicate through them, especially when someone is sensitive to it. And one of the most intense experiences I ever had with that happened in Allegheny. A lot of us who study this believe spirits interact with people every day on some level. It might show up as a sudden emotional shift, a change in someone's energy, or a person acting completely unlike themselves out of nowhere. I've seen people become irrational in an instant, like something just flipped a switch inside them. There was one night in Allegheny that still stays with me. My wife and I were visiting some friends at their dorm, and one of their roommates had been slipping into a pretty serious drinking habit. Her roommates told us that when she blacked out, she would act like she was possessed. She wouldn't remember any of it afterward. They said she would come out of her room with this empty, almost black-eyed stare, urinate on the floor, and become violently aggressive for no clear reason. My wife, Lana, and I were both sensitive to that kind of thing, and that night the energy in the dorm became too much. We stepped into the bathroom together just to get away from it for a minute. But once we were in there, we both got hit with this sudden panic. It came out of nowhere. Then, for some reason, we both felt this strong urge to turn off the lights. So we did. And in the darkness, we both saw them. 3 spirits rushing toward us, like they were trying to scare us or attack us. It happened so fast, but it was unmistakable. We both felt it. We both saw it. Afterward, we told our friends what happened, and they admitted there had been other strange things going on in the dorm, too. Things that had nothing to do with the roommates drinking. That confirmed what we already felt. Something was wrong in that place. But it didn't end there. Whatever we encountered that night followed us back to our apartment in Ohio. We already had some passive spiritual activity there, but this was different. It started escalating. Eventually, it got to the point where Lana began involuntarily channeling something, and that turned into what I can only describe as a possession. She had never experienced anything like that before. She wasn't even a believer up until then. But after that, she was. Bingo. That is exactly the feeling. When it's bad, I mean really bad. It starts at the back of your scalp. Then it rushes down your neck and spine, almost like a current, and spreads into your shoulders, all the way down to your elbows. It's that gut feeling, but stronger, sharper, like some inner Geiger counter clicking over something malevolent. Your energetic self is telling you, very clearly, that the place isn't just wrong. Whatever is there knows you're there. It has awareness. It has intent. And if there's someone nearby that it can influence, it can use them to look at you. Since I was a kid, there was one particular stretch along the Michigan lakeshore that I dreaded. It was in a sunny, wealthy area with beautiful lawns and clean streets, the kind of place that looks harmless from the outside. But there was this spot where Sheridan Road made a sudden hard left turn, and every time I went through there, my whole body reacted. For years, I thought maybe it was just the abruptness of the turn. Then I started looking into older maps, First Nation maps, early settlement records. South of that bend had been a major seasonal village. North of it, right where the road turned, had been a significant burial ground. That spot still has a different kind of energy. It buzzes. Years later, I became very interested in the First Nation tribes that had lived around my home. Some of them no longer exist as they once did. I read about the Fox and Sauk, about Black Hawk, and about how his ancestral lands were taken through wrongs done on both sides of a table where power was not equal. I admired him as a leader, and one weekend I planned to visit the area tied to his home camp near the Illinois and Mississippi rivers. I wanted to camp nearby, trace part of the route his people followed during the Black Hawk War, and just sit with the history of it. But trying to leave was impossible. It was one thing after another, delay after delay. Little problems that normally would not have stopped me kept stacking up until it was simply too late to go. I was frustrated, but I was also aware. Something I could not see and could not explain felt like it was physically blocking me. To this day, after decades of life, I have never felt anything exactly like that before or since. It was as if no matter what I did, nothing would help, because I was not supposed to make that trip. So I stayed home. I spent the weekend with my family, and we did good, ordinary things together. When I went back to work, a friend of mine came up to me. I'll call her Mara. She was half First Nations and had grown up on a reservation. Big eyes, big smile, even bigger heart. She looked at me and asked, very directly, "Where were you going to go?" I started naming the places I had planned to visit. Each time she said, "No." Another place. "No." Another. "No." Then I said, "Bad Axe, Wisconsin." And she lit up. Yes. Then she told me her story. That same long weekend, Mara and her boyfriend had gone riding out toward western Illinois. They stopped at a well-known family biker bar to get food, have a drink, and listen to music. While they were there, a woman Mara had never met walked right up to her. The woman said, "You look like the kind of person I'm supposed to tell this to." Then she sat down and told Mara what had happened earlier that day. She had been riding on the back of her husband's motorcycle. Another couple, longtime friends of theirs, was riding with them on a second bike. They were heading south along the Mississippi River Road, passing near Bad Axe, the area where Black Hawk and his band were finally cornered by militia, the U.S. Army, and a gunboat. Many did not survive. Many were starving. Many could not survive the river. As they passed that place, the woman suddenly started screaming. She was grabbing at her husband, jerking him, telling him to stop, to watch out, to get out of the way. Because in the road ahead of them, coming straight at them, were two First Nations warriors. Young men, powerful, on horseback. They were galloping up the road, charging directly toward the motorcycles with long lances lowered for a kill strike. The woman nearly pulled her husband off the bike, trying to make him stop or move. Both motorcycles swerved to the side of the road. Everyone was shouting, "What are you doing? Are you crazy? Didn't you see them?" "See who?" "The two men on horses in the middle of the road coming right at us with lances." Then there was silence. After a few minutes, everyone calmed down enough to talk. And it turned out both women had seen the same thing. Two warriors at full gallop, lances forward, one passing on either side of the bikes. But when the second woman looked back after they had passed, there was nothing there. No riders, no horses, nothing. They continued on, shaken, and later that day the first woman found Mara in that biker bar and told her the story without being asked. Then they talked politely for a few minutes, and the woman left. Mara stopped talking and looked me straight in the eyes, deeply, like she was weighing something she already knew. Then she said, "This has something to do with you, doesn't it?" About a year later, I no longer worked at that company. I was driving back from Minneapolis with my family when we passed near Bad Axe. It was winter. There was about a foot of fresh snow on the ground. I decided to finally go see it. It was sad there, but also beautiful, peaceful, quiet after the snowstorm. It was midday, no wind at all. As we drove in, bare trees lined the road. My wife was sitting next to me. And then we both saw it. In a tree ahead of us and slightly to the right, maybe at the 1 o'clock position, something moved. It was about 3/4 of the way up the tree, near a large limb. My wife jumped in her seat. She pointed with one hand, hit my arm with the other, and grabbed me. "What is that?" I'll be honest, I don't know. It started as movement. Something not white, but grayish. As it moved from left to right, it seemed to get larger or fuller, almost like it was expanding from all its edges at once, filling itself in, but never quite reaching a complete shape. It moved maybe 10 or 20 feet over several seconds, from the middle of the tree toward the outer edge. At its largest, it looked 4 or 5 feet across. The closest way I can describe it is a 3/4 sphere, like the shell of a sphere with 1/4 missing, so you could see both the outside and the curve of the inside. Then it just faded out. I stopped the truck as my wife yelled. We were near the end of the park road, not far from the Mississippi, close to where I believe the worst of it likely happened. My wife was babbling a little. "I saw that. You saw that. What the heck was that?" She does not swear, so even that told me how scared she was. I could feel her fear rising. So I lied. It was a soft lie, but still a lie. I said, "It was a snowy owl." Snowy owls do not really belong there like that, and what we saw was not an owl. But it was daytime, and it was the only explanation I could think of fast enough to help her calm down. She breathed out and said, "Yeah, that's what it was, a snowy owl." And she never brought it up again. We left after a few minutes. I will not go there again. For a while, I tried to explain it away. A puff of snow, a shadow, light on the windshield. But none of those explanations ever truly satisfied me. Then, about a month later, something happened. It was late at night. I was sitting in my truck with the lights off and the engine off, checking my phone before going inside. When I finished and looked up through the windshield, I saw something dimly lit moving through the air. I froze. Then I got out and looked up. I recognized it. It was the thing from Bad Axe. But this time, in the darkness, I could see it clearly. It was structured light, self-luminous, dim but distinct. It was fully formed now, a sphere, roughly 5 feet across. It was not rolling. It had orientation. It was moving with purpose. It was maybe 40 or 50 feet up, traveling northeast from the southwest. But it was not moving steadily like something carried by wind. It would pause slightly, then make sharp little turns. 10 degrees here, 20 there, then back again. And the wind was coming straight out of the east. This thing was crossing the wind, cutting across it. I watched it for maybe half a minute as it moved across the lot. Then it was just gone. Sometime later, I connected with an older couple who were Lakota. They were kind and polite, and they agreed to hear me out. I was hoping they might offer some guidance. We did not get very far. One of them excused herself. I do not know if she went to get something for herself or to do a blessing, or both. I had drawn what I saw at Bad Axe and what I saw above my truck a month later, hundreds of miles away. When they looked at the drawing, they both said the same thing at the same time. Actually, they blurted it. That's a medicine lodge. I guess I'll start with the first strange thing I can really remember. I was around 15 at the time, and my dad had this old fish tank set up in the living room. I'd be sitting there watching TV or sometimes standing nearby folding laundry, and every now and then I'd catch something out of the corner of my eye. It was like the tank light would suddenly dim, almost as if somebody had walked right in front of it. But when I turned to look, nobody was there. At first, I tried to brush it off. You know, reflections, shadows, maybe my eyes playing tricks on me. That's what you tell yourself when something doesn't quite fit. Years went by, and when I was about 22, I moved into an apartment with my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, and her roommate. One afternoon, we were lying in bed, just relaxing, and out of nowhere, I heard a man's voice say, very clearly, "Leave now." I'll never forget it. It wasn't muffled. It wasn't distant. It sounded like someone had leaned right up next to my ear and said it with force. I wasn't exactly terrified in that moment, but I was definitely confused. I looked over at my girlfriend and asked her if she had heard that. She told me she had heard something, but she couldn't make out the words. For me, there was no question. I knew exactly what I heard. Not much else happened in that apartment, at least not that I remember clearly. But there was one morning, around 3 a.m., when she was driving me to work. She told me she had woken up during the night while I was asleep, and something had been speaking to her in a language she didn't recognize. That one bothered me more than the voice I heard myself. It still gives me chills thinking about it. Fast forward about 9 or 10 years. By then, we were living in a different house. My wife and our son were asleep in the room next to me, and I was in the guest bedroom. It was probably around 11 at night. The room light was off, but the TV was on, so there was enough light to see down most of the hallway. I was sitting on the bed, scrolling on my phone, when I noticed movement on the hallway floor out of the corner of my eye. I looked up. Nothing. So I went back to my phone, and a few seconds later, I saw it again. This time, I didn't look directly at it right away. I tried to focus on it through my peripheral vision, because every time I looked straight at it, it disappeared. And that's when I saw what I can only describe as a woman in a pale nightgown crawling in a circle on the hallway floor. I know how that sounds. I really do. But I was seeing it. After a moment, she stood up. Then she started walking in that same slow circle in the hallway. Around and around, just moving in this strange, unnatural way. Then she stopped, and she looked right at me. The second she did, she sprinted toward the bedroom door. I mean full speed. Right as she reached the doorway, I threw my hand over and turned on the light. And she was gone. I sat there completely frozen, asking myself if that had actually just happened. The hair on my neck was standing straight up, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to get out of my chest. I still live in that same house now, and every once in a while, something strange still happens. There's a desk chair in my bedroom, and one night I woke up to it squeaking, like someone was sitting in it and rocking back and forth. Just as I became aware of the sound, something bumped against the side of my bed and hit my foot. Another time, I woke up to what I can only describe as a woman's laugh turning into a scream. It sounded cruel, almost angry. Thankfully, nothing has ever physically hurt me, and most of the time I don't feel like I'm in real danger. But I also can't honestly say these experiences feel harmless. They feel like something is there, and every so often, it wants me to notice.
So,
My family's had a narrowboat for more than 50 years now. It's one of those things that's always just been part of us, really. And over the years, we've had the odd, strange moment on the canals, the kind of thing you laugh off at first and then think about later, when everything's gone quiet. But this is the one I still can't explain. There are plenty of ghost stories around the canals, especially around the tunnels. And honestly, it makes sense. Some of those places have seen accidents, cave-ins, drownings, all sorts of grim history tucked into the brickwork. This happened when my dad, Martin, and I were taking our boat through Blisworth Tunnel. We'd done it countless times before, so it wasn't anything new to us. We were moving along steadily when we saw the headlamp of another boat entering from the far end. Nothing strange about that at first. The lamp wasn't especially bright, but neither was ours. That's just how it is sometimes. As we carried on, we could see the light coming closer, so we slowed down a bit, getting ready to pass. Blisworth Tunnel is wide enough for 2 narrowboats, but only just. There's really no room to be careless unless you fancy scraping paint and swapping a few sharp words in the dark. The other boat's light seemed to be about 200 yards ahead, maybe a little more, and it looked like it was sitting right in the middle of the tunnel. We could just about make out the shape of the bow behind the lamp. Then the light stopped moving. We figured the other boat had stopped to let us come through first. Maybe their headlamp was mounted off-center, we thought, because the boat still looked like it was dead in the middle. Odd, maybe, but not impossible. Then, after we'd gone another little stretch, the light started fading. At that point, we wondered if they were having trouble. Maybe engine problems, maybe electrical. So I went carefully along the gunwale toward the front of our boat, keeping my eyes on that light the whole time. I wanted to be ready to call out to them once we were close enough. Dad and I were both watching it. The headlamp was still there, weak and dim, and behind it, I could see what looked like the dark outline of the front of the boat. It wasn't drifting to one side. It was still right there in the middle. Then the lamp flickered and went out. I was close enough by then that I could still just make out the shape of the bow, or at least I thought I could. So I signaled back to Dad, basically warning him that we might be about to bump a dead boat in the tunnel. We were both expecting our own headlamp to catch it at any second. But it never did. There was no boat. Nothing in front of us. Nothing to the side. No sound, no movement, no engine, no voices, no ripple from another hull. Just the tunnel, our boat, and our own light crawling over wet brick. When we got out the other end, we saw a fisherman sitting there, so we asked him if any boats had come out before us in the last half hour. He said no. He told us he'd been there for most of the day, around 8 hours, and we were the first boat he'd seen either entering or leaving. That's when it really hit me, because looking back, the other boat had been completely silent. Normally, in a tunnel like that, you hear everything. Engines bounce off the walls. People talking echoes ahead of them. Even small sounds carry. But all we'd heard was ourselves. We never came up with a sensible explanation. We've been through Blisworth since, and plenty of other tunnels too, but nothing like that has ever happened again. And I still think about that little fading light, sitting there in the dark, waiting for us. I had an imaginary friend when I was little. His name was Milo. My mom still brings him up sometimes, usually with this soft little laugh, because apparently Milo and I were always getting into some kind of adventure. My dad says I was a sweet kid, a good kid, but every now and then I'd do something completely out of character and then calmly blame it on Milo. Both of my parents remember how much I talked to him. Not just here and there either. I mean constantly, like he was sitting right beside me, listening and answering. But the strange part was, whenever they tried to play along and include him, the way parents sometimes do, I'd look at them like they had missed something obvious. Then I'd giggle and say something like, Milo can't hold that. His body isn't real. So, in my little kid mind, he was real. He was there. Just not in the way everyone else was. Years went by. I grew up, started my own family, and eventually ended up living in that same childhood house again. My mom sold it to us when we were ready to settle down, and it felt kind of sweet at the time, raising my kids in the rooms where I had once been small. One afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my children. They were 4, 3, and 1 then. We were having lunch. Nothing unusual, just the normal, noisy little chaos of kids and plates and crumbs everywhere. Then my oldest looked at me with these sad, serious eyes and said, "Mommy, can you make Milo a plate too? He looks really hungry." I just sat there for a second, trying to understand what she had said. I asked, "Who's Milo, honey?" She pointed toward the front door and said, "The little boy over there. He plays with me sometimes, but he always leaves when you come in. He looks really hungry, Mommy." I turned and looked toward the door. There was no one there. So I turned back to her and smiled, trying to keep my voice calm. "There's nobody there, sweetheart. Go ahead and eat your lunch, okay?" And she said, very matter-of-factly, "Yeah, he said you can't see him anymore." Then she looked back toward the door, lifted her hand, and said, "Bye, Milo." That was the moment I remembered. Milo had been my imaginary friend, in this same house, when I was around the same age she was right then. After that, I started looking into the history of the house. I couldn't find anything about a child dying there, or any kind of tragedy connected to the place. But there's an old cemetery across the street, and eventually I thought, well, it couldn't hurt to look. So one day I took the kids on a walk. We wandered through the cemetery, and I read a few of the names out loud to them. We picked wildflowers, and the younger ones stayed near the stroller. Then suddenly, my oldest let go of the stroller handle and took off between the headstones. She wasn't running randomly. That's what I remember most. She moved like she knew exactly where she was going, weaving between the stones with this bright little purpose. Then she stopped in front of an older grave, much older than the ones we had been looking at. She started clapping, all excited, and turned back to me. "It's Milo," she called. "This is his bed." I got this cold, strange feeling all over me. I walked over, and there on the headstone was the name Milo. The dates were May 1904 to September 1910. We had found him. I asked my daughter how she knew it was his, because she couldn't read yet. She just looked at me and said she had seen him standing beside it. After that, we made an extra little plate for Milo at meals until she stopped seeing him. But not long after she stopped talking about him, her younger sister started mentioning a little boy named Milo. And then, over the years, each of my girls had him too, always around the ages of 3 or 4, and then he would fade away sometime around 5 or 6. My youngest is getting close to the age where Milo usually disappears, and honestly, when he's gone for good, I think part of me will miss him. This isn't the only strange story I have from that house, but it's one of the ones I hold closest. Look, what I'm about to share isn't easy for me to talk about. For a long time, I didn't even know how to explain it without feeling that cold pressure in my chest all over again. It became one of those moments in life where everything splits into before and after. I was 18 when it happened. Back then, I was too curious for my own good, and I let my friends push me into things I should have stayed far away from. One night, mostly out of curiosity, I ended up browsing through some strange Telegram groups. They were the kind of places where people shared disturbing videos, accidents, gore, things you know deep down you shouldn't be watching. At first, it was unsettling, but not exactly surprising. Just dark internet stuff. But then I came across one group with a name that made it sound like anything could be posted there. I clicked in, and there were all kinds of strange videos. Some were bizarre, some were graphic, some had symbols and weird edits. Then I saw one video that immediately made me feel uncomfortable. The thumbnail had strange markings on it, almost like occult symbols, and something about it felt wrong before I even opened it. I remember thinking, I should leave. This could be illegal. And I should have listened to that thought. But curiosity got the better of me. When I clicked the video, I realized within seconds that it was something I never should have seen. It was disturbing, illegal, and deeply wrong. But then, without warning, the footage shifted. Strange symbols appeared across the screen, symbols that looked like witchcraft or some kind of ritual writing. In the background, I could hear voices whispering or praying in a language I didn't recognize. That was when I felt it, a heavy, sick feeling in my stomach. Not normal fear, not disgust, something deeper. It felt like my body understood danger before my mind could. I closed everything, deleted the app, and tried to tell myself it was just shock, just guilt, just my imagination punishing me for looking at something I shouldn't have. But that night, things got worse. I went to bed and I had the most vivid dream I've ever had in my life. At least, I hope it was a dream. In it, I was walking out of my bedroom and moving slowly through the hallway of my house. Everything looked exactly the way it did in real life. The walls, the shadows, the silence. I walked all the way to the bathroom at the end of the hall. When I opened the door, the toilet was right in front of me, and the shower was off to the side. Then I heard a voice. "Hello." It was quiet, but it felt close. Too close. I turned to my right, toward the shower, and there was a little boy standing there. He was wearing a white robe or gown, and his face, I still don't like remembering it. His skin was pale, almost gray. Dark veins showed beneath it, and he had this awful smile stretched across his face. It wasn't playful. It wasn't human. It was the kind of smile that makes your blood turn cold, because you know there is nothing innocent behind it. I stepped back almost by instinct. Then I woke up. Or at least, I think I woke up. My face was wet with cold sweat, and my whole body felt like it had been thrown into pure survival mode. I've never considered myself easy to scare. I'm not the kind of person who jumps at every noise or believes every shadow means something. But that night, my body betrayed me. It reacted like something real had been standing right in front of me. I reached for my phone. The time was 3:33 a.m. Somehow, I eventually fell asleep again, though I don't remember how. The next morning, someone knocked on my bedroom door. It was a neighbor from nearby, and she asked me if I had been walking around the house during the night. I told her no. Then she said she'd heard footsteps in the hallway for hours. Back and forth, especially near the bathroom. She said the sound kept her awake almost the entire night. That was the moment I stopped trying to convince myself it was only a dream. After that, everything started falling apart. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly. I would wake up suddenly at the same time, 3:33 a.m., gasping like I had forgotten how to breathe. It felt like something invisible was pulling me out of sleep every night. And little by little, my life collapsed. My work suffered. My studies suffered. My money situation got worse. My mental health dropped. Even my physical health started slipping away from me. Before all of this, I had a routine. I went to the gym, I ate well, I studied, I worked, I had goals, I had energy. I was always trying to become better in every way I could. Then suddenly, I didn't want to do anything. It felt like someone had drained the life out of me. Years have passed since that night, and I'm still trying to recover. I have good days now, but every time I feel like I'm finally getting back on my feet, something seems to come along and knock me down again. I don't know what happened to me. Maybe it was trauma. Maybe it was my mind reacting to something horrible I saw. Maybe I opened a door I should have never gone near. Or maybe something really did follow me home. I'm sharing this because I still don't have answers. And honestly, part of me is scared I never will. There are a lot of strange stories tied to the house I grew up in. When my brother and I were little, things seemed much more active there. Over the years, it settled down quite a bit, but back then, it felt like the house had its own quiet pulse. And just to give a little context, my family isn't religious. None of us are. We're very science-minded people, which is probably why these experiences have stuck with us so much. We're not eager to label everything a ghost or a spirit. It's more that some things happened that we still can't explain, and that makes them hard to forget. Most of the strange things happened inside the house, but this one didn't. My dad and I have always been night owls. When I was a teenager, we used to go on late summer drives together. We'd roll the windows down, let the night air come in, and just talk about anything and everything. This was when we had phones, but service would disappear pretty easily once you got out into the back roads. My dad, being my dad, always kept an old satellite GPS in the trunk. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if he still has one tucked away somewhere. One night, it must have been around 2 in the morning, we were driving through a rural area about 20 minutes from home. He had a general idea of where we were, but I think he wanted the quickest route back. So he pulled over and said he was going to grab the GPS from the trunk. He got out, opened the trunk, got the GPS, came back, stuck it to the windshield with that little suction cup mount, and then we kept driving. And then, maybe a minute later, something in me just snapped awake. I remember looking at him and saying, "Why did you stop there?" He looked completely confused and asked, "What do you mean?" And I said, "The man." From my point of view, when we pulled over, there was someone standing about 10 feet in front of the car, right near the edge of the road. On one side of us was a cornfield. On the other side was dense woods. The headlights lit him up clearly. He was standing still, facing toward the trees. I remember him wearing a baseball cap, and I'm pretty sure he had a backpack on. He didn't move once. Not when we pulled over. Not when my dad got out. Not when my dad opened the trunk. Not when he came back and set up the GPS. He just stood there. And I just sat there, staring at him. That's the part that bothers me the most, honestly. Not just that I saw him, but how I reacted. Because that was not me. I'm anxious. I scare easily. If I saw a random man standing by the woods in the middle of the night, I would have immediately told my dad. I would not have let him get out of the car. I would have locked the doors, panicked, asked what we should do, maybe wondered if we needed to call someone. But I didn't do any of that. I sat there, silently, staring at this man like I had no alarm bells in my body at all. When I finally told my dad what I had seen, he said he hadn't seen anyone. Nothing. No man, no backpack, no figure at the edge of the road. And that made everything feel even stranger. I still ask him about it sometimes, just to make sure he remembers the conversation afterward. He does. He remembers me suddenly reacting once we were already driving again. He remembers me being shaken. But he never saw the man. We didn't turn around. I don't know why. Maybe we were too creeped out. Maybe we just wanted to get home. But normally, I would have wanted to go back and check. I would have wanted to know if he was still there. That was probably 8 or 10 years ago now, and I still think about it. It wasn't just the man by the road. It was the feeling that, for those couple of minutes, I wasn't reacting like myself at all. Like some part of me had been put on pause. My dad had a strange experience of his own when he was younger, back in that same family house, where something frightening happened and he also didn't react the way he normally would have. So I don't know what to call it, but I know what I saw. And whatever it was, it still unsettles me. I've got a lot of strange stories I could tell, but this one still sits with me in a way I don't think I'll ever fully shake. This happened a few years back, late at night, after my kids had finally fallen asleep. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get when everyone else is dreaming and you're the only one still awake. I was sitting at my desk, messaging a friend who lived overseas. We were going back and forth like normal, just chatting, when suddenly, something in the room changed. I don't know how else to explain it. It felt like the darkness had leaned in closer. The air went still. Not peaceful still, but wrong still. It was like every normal little house sound had disappeared at once, and something heavy had taken its place. I started typing to my friend, trying to explain how uneasy I felt. Before I could really make sense of it, he messaged me back and said, "Read what you just sent." So I looked, and my stomach dropped. The message I meant to send was something like, "I feel like the atmosphere in my house just changed. I can't explain it, but I don't think I'm alone." But that wasn't all it said. Right in the middle of my sentence were words I know I did not type. It said, "Mara is here. Deal with it. I'm not your friend. Ha ha ha." The second I read it, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. My arms broke out in goosebumps, and then I felt something brush across my shoulder. Not a breeze, not a loose strand of hair. Something touching me. The room had gone freezing cold, but there was this strange electric feeling in the air too, like the whole space was charged. I turned around in my chair, and behind me was the figure of a young woman. She was tall, but not in a normal way. Her body looked stretched out and uneven, with long arms raised toward the ceiling. Her face was almost completely shadowed, even though she was staring right at me. I wanted to scream. Every part of me wanted to. But my daughters were asleep nearby, and all I could think was, what if they wake up? What if they see this? So I forced myself to stay as calm as I could. My voice was shaking, but I told her she had to leave my home. I told her she was not welcome there. I told her I was not afraid enough to let her stay. The room seemed to get darker after that. The air felt thick, almost hard to breathe through. I started reciting the prayer for protection, quietly at first, then stronger. I walked toward the front door, still praying, still picturing my daughters and myself surrounded by light, love, and protection. When I opened the door, I said her name once and told her she had to leave. I kept repeating the prayer and imagined pushing every bit of that dark presence out of my house. I don't know how long it took. It probably wasn't long at all, but in the moment it felt stretched and strange, like time had gone soft around the edges. Then I closed the door, locked it, and stood there trying to breathe. The next morning, both of my daughters told me they'd had the same kind of dream. They said a very tall teenage girl had been trying to wake them up. Then my older daughter looked straight at me and asked, "Mom, who's Mara? And why was she so angry with you?" I felt the blood drain out of my face. I told her not to say that name again. Not because I wanted to scare her, but because I didn't want that thing to feel invited back into our home. For about a week after that, I could still feel that dark energy around the property. Sometimes in the front yard, sometimes near the back. But every time I said the prayer for protection, it would pull back. Eventually, it faded completely. I still don't know what Mara was. I don't know why she came into my house, or why she chose that night to make herself known. But I do know this. Nothing has ever frightened me the way she did. I've lived in a couple of houses that felt haunted, but there was one place where things went far beyond just a strange feeling. That was the house where I actually saw something. After we moved in, I kept getting this sensation that a girl was watching me. It was hard to explain, but it always seemed to come from the same side of the house, almost like there was a spot where the air had memory in it. Then the dreams started. In the dreams, there was a young boy, maybe 13 or 14. He looked like he belonged in the 1980s, with the clothes and the hair, all of it. He never really spoke much. He would just show me things. A headstone, bushland, a car, and then he would point in one direction. The only word he ever said was, "Mum." The dreams happened so often that I finally asked an older neighbor whether there had ever been a crash on the highway near our place. I thought maybe that was what he was trying to show me. She told me no, not near the house. Then one night, my ex dropped me home after studying. It was around 2 in the morning. From outside, it looked like every light in the house was on. But the second I opened the front door, the whole place was pitch black. That really shook me. After that, I made my boyfriend walk me right to the door every time he dropped me off. I asked my family the next day if they had left the lights on, and they all said no. They had turned everything off before bed. Another time, a small ornament in my bedroom suddenly flew across the room and hit the wall. It didn't break, which somehow made it feel even stranger, like whatever threw it knew exactly how much force to use. But the worst thing happened early one morning. It was around 4, light enough to make out shapes but still dim. I woke up because someone was walking around my room. They were moving slowly, looking around in this curious, snooping way, almost like they were searching for something. At first, I only saw the figure from behind. It looked thin and male, so in my half-asleep state, I thought it was my brother. I sat up, annoyed, and said, "What are you looking for?" The figure reacted immediately. It turned its head toward me, and that was when I saw it had no face. It wasn't my brother. It walked out of my room, but then it did something I'll never forget. It leaned its blank, faceless head back around the edge of my doorway, like it was taking one last look at me. Then it walked away toward the lounge room, which was the opposite direction from all the bedrooms. I didn't even trust what I had just seen, so I got up and checked every bedroom. Everyone was asleep. No one had been in my room. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like a human shape made from gray smoke, except the edges weren't wispy or messy. They were smooth. And when it bent its neck to look at me, it moved at an angle no human neck should be able to move. Years after we moved out, I was dating someone new named Kalen. I had never told him anything about that house. One day, he mentioned that he had gone to look at a room in a share house, but he couldn't take it because the feeling inside was too awful. He said the place felt wrong the second he stepped in. I asked him where it was. It was the exact same house. Then, years later, I was going through old newspapers on microfilm, and this is the part that sounds made up, but it isn't. 2 doors down from that house, in the same direction where I always felt watched from, there had been a woman living with 2 young teenagers in the 1980s, a boy and a girl. In one of the newspaper photos, I saw the exact car from my dreams. The story said their mother had some kind of breakdown. It seems she may have drugged the children, put them in the family car, and driven out to bushland in the same direction the boy in my dreams had always pointed. She killed them there, and then herself. And after all those dreams, all those strange things, all that time of him showing me the car and the bushland and saying only one word, I finally understood what he had been trying to tell me. Mom. I used to live in this old house with my ex, Clara. It wasn't ancient or anything, but it definitely had that kind of tired, settled-in feeling, like the walls had been listening for decades. There were boxes and odd little things up in the attic that looked like they went back to the 1950s, maybe even earlier. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just an old house with old bones. But things happened there. Small things at first, then stranger ones. The basement was partly finished, but we mostly used it for storage. I was really the only one who ever went down there. One morning, I got home from work around 5:30, still half asleep and running on fumes, and I noticed the basement light was on. I could see it glowing through the little basement windows from outside. The weird part was, I hadn't been down there in weeks, maybe longer. Later that day, I asked Clara if she'd gone down there for anything, and she said no. She hadn't touched it. Another time, we went to bed like usual. Upstairs, all the bedroom doors were closed, except the bathroom door, which we always left cracked open. When we woke up the next morning, every single door upstairs was wide open. Not just slightly open, wide open, like someone had walked down the hall and pulled each one back. Then there was the basement itself. It was mostly one big open room, except for a small room tucked into one corner. But right in the middle of the open area, there was this big plastic utility sink and, for some reason, a toilet. Just sitting there. No walls around it, no sign there ever had been walls. Just a random basement toilet, standing there like it had been waiting for someone. And I know this sounds ridiculous, but anytime I spent more than a few minutes down there, I would suddenly get the strongest urge to use the bathroom, even if I had just gone before heading down. It happened enough times that I started joking the toilet was cursed, like it was trying to lure me in. Maybe it wanted a sacrifice. Maybe it was after my soul in the least dignified way possible. I don't know. It was absurd, but it was also genuinely weird. One night, Clara woke me up in a panic. I was completely asleep, dead to the world, and she shook me awake asking, "Did you just say my name?" I told her no, obviously. I'd been asleep. She said a man's voice had woken her up. Not just whispering or mumbling either. It had said her full name. First, middle, and last. Clear enough that she knew exactly what she'd heard. The thing that bothered me most, though, happened one night after 1 a.m. I was downstairs on the couch watching a show. Clara was upstairs asleep. The whole house was quiet. From where I was sitting, I could see part of the staircase leading down from the second floor, but not the very bottom where it opened near the front door. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone coming down the stairs. Long, dark hair, moving quietly. I just assumed it was Clara. But there were no footsteps, no creaking, nothing. And then whoever it was never came fully into view. I waited a second, expecting her to step around the corner. She didn't. So I leaned way over from the couch, trying to see the bottom of the stairs and the front door area. No one was there. The front door was closed. Nothing had opened. Nothing had moved. Whoever or whatever I saw had simply come down the stairs and vanished. Eventually, Clara and I broke up. She moved out, and later I moved into a condo. I figured that was the end of it. New place, newer building, no creepy basement toilet, No old attic full of dusty relics. Clean slate. Then one night, I woke up around 3 in the morning, which almost never happens. I sleep like a rock. I'm the kind of person who can sleep through alarms, storms, and probably a minor parade. But I woke up suddenly, wide awake enough to know something felt wrong. I looked at the clock, confused, then sat up a little. At the foot of my bed, there was a figure crouched down. I stared at it for a long time. Not a quick glance. Not one of those half-second, maybe I imagined it things. I looked at it for probably 30 seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. And then, honestly, I was so tired that I just thought, nope, not dealing with this. Laid back down and went to sleep. In the morning, with daylight in the room, I checked the foot of the bed to see if there was anything that could have looked like a crouched person in the dark. A chair, a pile of clothes, a shadow, anything. There was nothing. That was the part that got to me later. In the moment, I was too exhausted to care. But once I was awake and thinking clearly, it really unsettled me. So, yeah. The old house had strange doors, lights turning on by themselves, a voice calling Clara by her full name, and something with long, dark hair that disappeared at the bottom of the stairs. And somehow, even after I moved out, something still seemed to know where I was. I only had one experience like this, and it happened last year when I was at university. I rented one of the end units in this old triplex, and I lived there by myself for the whole school year. From the very first night, little things started happening. Nothing huge at first, just strange enough to make me pause. That first night, I took off my wristwatch and set it on top of a magazine on the couch. In the morning, it was gone. I tore the place apart looking for it, but I never found it again. Then there was this spare clock radio I had plugged in near the bathroom sink. It kept switching itself on in the middle of the night, always to static. Just loud, hissing dead air, loud enough to wake me up from down the hallway. The cellar door was another thing. It would unlatch by itself and slowly swing open. The switch for the parking lot security light was down there too, and somehow it kept getting turned off. I'd go down, turn it back on, and later it would be off again. One night, I was reading in bed when something appeared right beside me. It looked like a pale white mist, almost like fog, but it didn't drift in from anywhere. It kind of grew outward from one little point until it was about the size of a short person, maybe a teenager. It stayed there just long enough for me to look at it, maybe 1 or 2 seconds, and then it folded back into itself and vanished. The strange thing is, I wasn't scared. I got up, checked the outlets, unplugged my stereo, and left the light on for the rest of the night. Somehow, I still fell asleep. After that, I started hearing voices downstairs when I was in bed. Sometimes footsteps too, coming up the stairs. I kept telling myself I was half asleep, and maybe I was. It never jolted me fully awake. It was more like I'd surface just enough to notice it, then sink back under. Then, just after Christmas, I locked myself out one night. I went over to the neighbor's place while I waited for my friend, Nolan, to come by with my spare keys. The other 2 units were both rented by women in their 30s. One of them had a kid, I think. We'd barely spoken before that night. We had a couple of beers, and after a while, one of them nudged the other and said, "Ask him." So the other one looked at me and said, "Have you ever had anything weird happen in your unit?" I played dumb at first. I didn't want to be the guy who says, "Actually, yes, my rental might be haunted." But then they started telling me their own stories. They talked about noises, things disappearing, laundry going missing from the bed before it could even be put away. One of them said her boyfriend once ran into something in the upstairs hallway in the middle of the night, and after that, he refused to sleep over again. So I finally told them what had been happening to me. That's when they told me my unit had always been the worst one. One neighbor said she'd hear footsteps tearing up and down the stairs in my place during the day while I was away on campus. Not once or twice, all the time. That bothered me more than anything else, because it meant things were happening even when I wasn't there to imagine them. They also told me the tenants before me had lived there for years, close to a decade, but eventually left because the disturbances got too irritating. Apparently, the biggest problem was the kitchen at night. Chairs scraping, things moving around, and sounds like a group of men sitting around playing cards. That made something click for me. When I first called the landlord about the place, he told me it was empty because the long-term tenants had gotten odd. He never explained what that meant. He just said they'd moved into another property he owned across town. At the time, I figured they just wanted a change. After that night, I couldn't really brush everything off anymore. When Nolan arrived with my keys, I told him what the neighbors had said. He got quiet, then admitted he hated going into my place over Christmas break to feed my fish while I was out of town. He said one day he'd stop by and all the lights would be off. The next night, every light would be on. Little things would be moved around too. His wife went with him once and refused to go inside after that. She remembered leaving lights on the night before, and when they came back, the whole place was dark. That shook her badly. I still stayed there for the rest of the school year. One night, I just spoke out loud to whatever was in the house. I said something like, "You can stay here with me, but don't scare me, don't steal my things, and don't mess with me." And honestly, it seemed to help. From January to May, not much happened. Doors still opened sometimes. The hallway closet light would switch on by itself. Once, while I was printing an essay late at night, I swear someone came up behind me and leaned over my shoulder. I jumped, then laughed and said, "Please don't do that." It never happened again. Still, I changed the way I lived. I started staying up until dawn before going to sleep. I spent as much time away from the place as I could. I stayed at my girlfriend's apartment out of town whenever possible. I didn't tell most of my friends about it until the very end of the school year. We had an all-night hockey party, and I'd had enough to drink that I finally brought it up. I thought they'd all laugh or think I was losing it. But they didn't. Instead, a few of them started telling their own stories. Weird things they'd seen or heard and never really talked about. That's what stayed with me, honestly. I think this kind of thing happens more often than people admit. Most of us just keep it quiet, because saying it out loud makes it feel too real. A couple of years back, we rented this tiny little Airbnb tucked away in the Texas Hill Country. It was one of those cute, peaceful cabins that looks like it belongs on a postcard, and the host mentioned, very casually, that it had been built on what she called energy lines. At the time, we just smiled at that. You know, one of those quirky listing details you don't think too much about. The place was way out in the country. I mean really out there. No neighbors, no porch lights in the distance, no cars passing by. Just trees, open land, and this huge dark sky pressing in from every direction. Honestly, it was exactly what we thought we wanted. Quiet, remote, a place to unplug and breathe for a few days. Inside, there was one bedroom and a loft. The bedroom had bunk beds and a full-size bed, so we gave that to our boys. My husband and I took the loft since it had the bigger bed. The first night was completely fine. A little strange, maybe, just because the darkness was so deep and the silence was almost too quiet. It's one thing to read "secluded" in a listing. It's another thing entirely to stand there at night and realize there is nothing around you but black windows and your own thoughts. But still, nothing happened. We slept well and woke up to one of those soft, golden mornings that makes everything feel harmless again. The second night was different. I woke up from a nightmare that felt far too real. In the dream, this shriveled old man with glowing red eyes was crawling across the loft floor toward me. He climbed up onto the bed and slipped under the covers, and then I felt his hand around my ankle. It was dry and hot and twisted, and he started grabbing at my leg, moving higher, like he was trying to pull himself closer. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then I woke up. Only I couldn't move. At that exact moment, my husband, Daniel, shouted my name. His voice was full of panic. He started slapping at the bed and yelling, "No, no!" That snapped me out of it. I gasped and sat straight up, pulling my legs to my chest while he tore the blankets back and reached for the lamp. There was nothing there. No old man, no shadow, nothing under the covers, nothing beside the bed. But both of us were terrified. Daniel told me he had been dreaming that something dark, something he described as almost demon-like, was trying to drag me off the bed and down onto the floor, like it wanted to pull me underneath, and I had been dreaming about that horrible old man crawling toward me. Neither one of us wanted to stay in that loft after that. We went downstairs to check on the boys. They woke up a little when we opened the bedroom door, but they were fine, sleepy, confused, completely safe. So we stayed downstairs. There was a small daybed in the living area, and we curled up there together, wide awake now, suddenly very aware that none of the windows or doors had curtains. During the day, that had seemed charming, open, airy. At night, it felt like the whole world could look in. And I know how this sounds, but we both had the strongest feeling that we were being watched. Then something moved outside. Just a shape in the dark at first, coming closer to the back door. We froze. I remember holding Daniel's hand so tightly my fingers hurt. And then it stepped into the porch light. A cat. Just a cat. One of the feral cats the host had told us about. She said they roamed the property and were friendly, but they weren't allowed inside the cabin. We had seen a few earlier that day, and this was one of the bigger tabbies. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like she knew we needed her. So we opened the door and stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The air was warm and still, with heat lightning flickering way off in the distance. That cat came right up to us and let us pet her, purring like a little engine. And somehow, that changed everything. The fear started to loosen. The night didn't feel so hostile anymore. It was still dark, still quiet, but not empty in the same way. After a while, we got sleepy again. We went back inside, and believe it or not, we went back up to the loft. And we slept just fine. But for a few minutes there, in that tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere, I have never felt so certain that something had come very close to us. Years ago, I worked for a care agency that had a little staff flat for whoever was covering the overnight shift. The setup was simple enough. The main office was at the front of the building, and from there, a long, narrow hallway led down to the bedroom, then the bathroom, and finally the kitchen at the very back. There was CCTV in the office that showed the rear yard. It covered the back door into the kitchen and the kitchen window too. But there was no security light outside, nothing like that. Just the camera watching the dark. And I'll be honest with you, from almost the first time I worked there, I hated that kitchen. I do not mean I disliked it in some ordinary way. I mean there was something about that room that made my whole body react before my brain could explain why. It always felt as though someone was standing in one particular corner, watching me. Not just watching either. It felt hostile, heavy, wrong. Whenever I went in there, my heart would start hammering and my hands would get sweaty. I'd feel this awful dread blooming in my chest, like my instincts were screaming at me to get out. Eventually, I stopped going into the kitchen after dark altogether. When I arrived for a night shift, I would do everything while it was still light. I'd check the switches, make sure things were off, then bring the kettle, mugs, and anything else I might need through to the office. I basically made a little survival camp at the desk so I would not have to go back there. One night, I had done exactly that. I was sitting in the office, trying to settle in, when I suddenly felt it. That presence. Only this time, it did not feel like it was in the kitchen. It felt like it was standing right outside the office door. I cannot explain how I knew. I just did. It was that unmistakable feeling of being watched from the doorway, so strong that I could barely breathe properly. After a while, I got so uncomfortable that I kicked the door shut with my foot, then moved my chair to the other side of the room so I could sit facing it. That also put me right beside the CCTV monitor. I glanced over at the screen, and my stomach just dropped. The kitchen light was on. Not a reflection, not a blur. Outside on the camera, everything was pitch black except for that kitchen window glowing brightly in the middle of the screen. I sat there, staring at it, frozen, hoping it would switch off by itself. I kept telling myself there had to be a normal explanation, but the only normal explanation was that someone was in the building. Eventually, I knew I had to check. I was almost crying by then. I opened the office door just enough to look down the hallway toward the kitchen, and the light was off. Completely off. I looked back at the CCTV monitor, and now the screen showed it off too. Just darkness at the back of the building. I remember feeling this horrible confusion, because somehow that was even worse than if I had found a person there. I checked the CCTV recording after that. I played it back, stopped it, rewound it, watched it again and again, trying to convince myself it had been showing an earlier moment, or that I had misunderstood what I saw. But it clearly showed the kitchen light coming on at a time when it absolutely should not have been on, then going off again. I did not go to bed that night. I stayed on the sofa in the office until morning because I was too frightened to walk down the hallway to the bedroom. When the day staff arrived, I checked the back door with them. It was locked properly. Nothing was open. Nothing looked disturbed. And I had the only set of keys, so there was no reasonable way anyone else could have come in. A few days later, another staff member, Leah, finished a night shift and asked me quietly, "Have you ever felt like this place is strange at night?" I did not tell her anything at first. I just asked her what she meant. And then she described the same feeling, the same horrible presence, the same spot in the kitchen. That made my skin go cold, because it meant I had not imagined it. Not long after that, I was on nights again. This time I was in the bedroom, which was on the ground floor and looked out toward the backyard and the kitchen. I had just turned off the bedroom light when I noticed a glow outside. I went to the blinds and looked through them. I could see straight into the kitchen. The light was on again. I stood there for ages, trying to gather enough courage to move. Then I opened the bedroom door and looked down the hall. The kitchen was dark. I went back into the bedroom, looked out again, and the glow was gone. Leah had a few odd experiences there too, though I cannot remember all the details now. What I do remember is that after those nights, neither of us ever really slept when we were on shift in that building. I have never experienced anything like it since, and after all these years, I still cannot explain what was happening in that kitchen. I've had a handful of strange experiences over the years, but most of them happened in one particular building I used to clean, and one night there changed me. I worked for a cleaning company, and we handled the housekeeping for a performing arts group. One of their venues was this old Orpheum-style theater. Beautiful place, but from my very first shift, something about it felt off. At first, it was small things, stuff falling from shelves, distant screams when no one was around, heavy footsteps from somewhere above me. And that's the thing. These old theaters are built solid. Granite, marble, concrete floors. You could have a couple hundred people moving around upstairs and hear voices, maybe a little shuffling, but you don't hear clear, heavy footsteps. So the first time I heard those slow, thudding steps above me, it stopped me cold. The first night, I wasn't alone when a roll of paper towels jumped off a shelf. A couple of my coworkers saw me notice it. I didn't say anything, and then a second roll flew off even harder, like whatever was there didn't appreciate being ignored. My coworkers just looked at me and said, "Yeah, this place is haunted. You'll get used to it." I learned pretty quickly that whatever was in that building did not like being dismissed. There were a lot of incidents after that, but the one that really changed things was the night I got chased out. We had been finishing up another building, and after that we needed to go over to the theater to make sure it was ready for a show the next day. I got impatient waiting on everyone else, so I told the crew I'd head over first and get started. I came in through a side entrance. Rehearsal was already over. The actors were gone. Security was gone. The staff had left. As far as I knew, I was the only person in the building. I started my walkthrough on the lowest level, checking the back of house areas first. That was the part of the theater most people hated. It always felt heavy back there, like the air was watching you breathe. But that night, strangely enough, it felt calm. No footsteps, no voices, no feeling of being watched. Nothing. So I moved toward the front of the theater. I checked the auditorium. Everything was fine. I checked the lobby. Still fine. Then I checked the men's restroom and the women's restroom. I was almost done. But the second I stepped out of the women's restroom, the whole atmosphere shifted. It was like something dark poured into the lobby all at once. I heard a voice near the entrance to the auditorium, but I couldn't make out what it said. I stopped and listened. Then I heard the trash bag and the can by that entrance being moved around. I called out, "Hello? Is someone in there?" Right then, one of the stall doors in the women's restroom behind me started slamming. I turned and looked back at the restroom doorway, which was only a few feet away. Then I heard the trash bag move again, this time closer. I looked toward it, and the bag and the trash can right near me shifted on its own. That's when the big guy got me. That's what everyone called him. We believed he was the thing behind the heavy footsteps, the deep screams, and that awful presence people felt in the building. Later that week, I even caught what looked like a huge figure a few times on an SLS camera app. But that night, I didn't see him. I felt him. I didn't get grabbed. Nothing touched me. But every sense I had, except my eyesight, suddenly screamed that something huge, fast and furious had rushed up behind me and stopped about an inch from the back of my neck. It was the strangest, most terrifying feeling I've ever had. Every part of me said, "Get out." And I did. I moved through that lobby, into the atrium, and out the front doors at a speed that wasn't exactly running, but it definitely wasn't walking either. That feeling stayed right on the back of my neck until I got through the atrium doors. I went back to the other building, and my girlfriend, who worked with me, saw my face immediately. She asked, "What happened?" All I could do was hand her badge back to her and say, "I will never step foot in that building alone again. It's ready for tomorrow. I'll be in the car when you're done." Then I walked away. That night changed me because, up until then, I had always handled paranormal things by ignoring them. I wanted nothing to do with it. I didn't invite it, didn't talk to it, didn't entertain it. I was closed off to it on purpose. Honestly, I had probably told completely normal household noises they weren't welcome more than once. A water heater would kick on, and there I'd be, telling the empty air to get away from me. But after that night, I wasn't just scared. I was angry. Because whatever that thing was, it had gotten to me. It had put real fear in me. Not the kind you can talk yourself out of either. My body was leaving that building, whether my brain agreed or not. So after that, I started researching. I began doing rough, amateur investigations in the theater. Nothing fancy, just me trying to understand what was there. It felt like being a boxer who lost the title and wanted a rematch. And I got some interesting responses. That's when I started calling the big guy the coward, because whenever more than one person was around, he kept his distance. He would linger at the edges, but he wouldn't come close like he did when I was alone. And he really didn't seem to like it when I caught him on the SLS app. Out of everything that happened in that theater, that night was the most undeniable. That was the night I stopped ignoring it. I was around 18 at the time, and I'd already had enough strange experiences that I didn't really question whether something was out there. I was deep into ghost hunting back then, and honestly, I had started getting way too attached to the Ouija board. Looking back, it wasn't healthy. It had become this doorway I kept standing too close to. My friend, though, he didn't believe in any of it. He was the kind of person who needed proof right in front of him before he would even consider something. Then one rainy afternoon in the middle of summer, he finally agreed to try the board with me. It was his first time. We went to his old childhood house. His family had recently moved out, but the place hadn't sold yet, so it was just sitting there empty. We ended up setting everything up in what used to be his younger sister's bedroom. We had the board on the floor, 2 candles lit, no lights on. There was only this gray, stormy daylight coming through the window. The bedroom door was mostly closed, but not all the way, because the carpet kept it from catching properly in the frame. We started the session, and at first it gave us a few simple answers. Nothing too dramatic. Then I decided to ask it something personal, something my friend wouldn't know. I said, "What is my dad's middle name?" My dad passed away when I was a baby, and my friend didn't know his first name, let alone his middle name. The planchette started moving, slow and deliberate. Lloyd. Lloyd. That was right. The second I told my friend it was correct, the whole feeling in the room changed. It wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It felt like we had knocked on a door, and something had answered from much closer than we expected. Then a few things happened almost at the same time. The planchette drifted all the way across the board, went over the edge, and slid onto the carpet right beside my phone. As soon as it stopped there, my phone started ringing. I don't even remember who was calling. I just remember the sound of it cutting through that room. At the same moment, both candles flickered so low they almost went out. Neither of us said anything. We just panicked. We both jumped up and ran for the door without closing the session. I got there first, and right before I could grab it, that door slammed, fully shut into the frame, right in front of my face. The same door that had been stuck slightly open because of the carpet. That was it. We were done. We tore out of that room, out of that house, straight into my car, and left. I don't really remember what we did after that. I think my brain just filed the rest of the day away somewhere quiet. But later, when I went home, something else happened. I was standing on my front porch, unlocking the door to my own house. which already had a long history of being terrifying in its own way. And right as I was opening the door, I heard someone yell my name directly into my ear. It sounded like they were standing right beside me. Not across the porch, not behind me in the yard. Right there, close enough to feel. I rushed inside, but honestly, that didn't feel much safer. That house had never felt safe to me. I have so many stories from that place. Now that I'm older, I understand that spending 13 years of my childhood in a house where I always felt watched, always felt afraid, actually did something to me. I never really felt secure there. I was always bracing for something. And there were worse things than that Ouija board session. The haunting in my childhood home eventually built up to the day I came face to face with a shadow figure. And that was one of the most deeply frightening moments of my life. But talking about that house is heavy. There's a lot buried there. For some reason, though, that rainy afternoon with the board still stays with me. The empty house, the candles, the name, the phone ringing, and that door slamming shut. It felt like something followed the sound of my question home. I used to be exactly where you are. I believed in the paranormal from the time I was young. Ghosts, monsters, demons, hidden realms, strange little cracks in the world where something else might be looking back. I read everything I could get my hands on. I went to supposedly haunted places. I listened to friends and relatives tell their stories, and honestly, after a while, I started to feel left out. I wanted something of my own. Then, without any warning, I got it. I've had 2 encounters in my life that I cannot explain away. Not stories somebody told me, not rumors. I was there. I was part of it. And if I could go back and talk to the version of me who was so hungry for proof, I'd tell myself 2 things. First, be careful what you ask for. I know that sounds worn out, but I mean it. The energy you send out, that wanting, that invitation, you don't really know what might hear it. Second, I learned very quickly that I do not understand those other places, not even a little. Whatever exists beside us, beneath us, around us, there are things out there you do not want to meet, things you'll wish you could unknow. So be patient, be respectful. I don't think it's a matter of if something answers you. I think it's a matter of when. But I would not recommend chasing it. Let it come on its own terms. Now I'll tell you about one of my encounters. This happened a few years ago, when COVID was finally starting to loosen its grip on everything. I was living in Dallas at the time, and because of a sudden mess of circumstances, I had to move almost immediately. I didn't have much money, didn't have much of a plan, and life had basically grabbed me by the collar and dragged me back toward Oklahoma. I arranged to stay with one of my aunts when I got there. She was living with her boyfriend way out in the country. And when I say way out, I mean the kind of country where the dark feels older than the roads. You had to pull water from a well. Cell service only worked if you stood in one specific spot near one specific window. And even then, you had to hold your mouth right. What I didn't know was that my aunt and her boyfriend were in the middle of a serious fight. So when I pulled in, she was on her way out. And she stayed gone. 4 days, 3 nights. Before I go further, I need to explain something. Over the years, people in my family had talked about something out there. Young relatives, older ones, people I trusted, people I wasn't so sure about. They all had different names for it, but the stories carried the same shape. Something big lived in those woods. Nobody had really seen it clearly, but people knew it was there. They said if you walked around outside at night, it would follow you. Not quietly enough to be mistaken for nothing either. It wanted you to know it was there. I always treated those stories like a family-made urban legend. Creepy, sure, but not something I let settle too deep in my mind. That first night, I was alone in my aunt's place, which was basically an old school bus converted into a camper. It was just me and my cat, Otis. I was playing The Last of Us Part 2 with my headphones on, trying to distract myself from the weirdness of being stranded out there. After a while, I noticed Otis acting strange. He was usually calm, very low-key, but now he was staring at something outside the bus, and every bit of fur on him was standing up. I had never seen him look like that. I took off my headphones, and that's when I heard him making this sound. It wasn't a growl exactly, and it wasn't a meow. It was low, shaky, almost warbled. The kind of sound a cat makes before a fight, except deeper. More like a warning. Then he stopped. Just completely stopped. He lowered his head and started tracking something outside. Something moving toward the bus. That was when I noticed the silence. Not normal quiet. Not nighttime country quiet. This was predator silence. Heavy silence. Silence with weight in it. No wind. No insects. No frogs. No dogs barking somewhere in the distance. Nothing. The whole world had gone still. I held my breath and watched my cat's head follow whatever was outside as it reached the bus and began to move around it. Not walk around it. It was like it twisted around it. Otis's head kept turning, slowly, carefully, following it as it moved along the outside of the bus. And I don't know how to explain this, but in that moment, I suddenly knew a few things. I knew it was old, ancient even. I knew it was huge, about the size of a bear, maybe bigger. I knew it was unbelievably quiet, and I knew it was studying the bus, studying me, looking for the fastest way in if it decided it needed one. The way it moved was impossible to picture clearly. The closest I can come is smoke, snake, and big cat all at once. But that still isn't right. It was not any of those things. That's just the only language I have for it. I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger, exactly. But I felt like danger was standing right there with its hand on the door. Like one wrong move from me could change everything. And I had no intention of finding out what that wrong move was. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it started to leave. Otis kept tracking it as it unwound itself from the bus and moved back toward the woods. But before it disappeared, it pressed its body against the front of the bus. The whole thing rocked, hard, back and forth several times. It felt like another vehicle had hit us. Not a crash exactly, but force, power. If I had been standing, I think I would have been thrown into the wall. That was when I understood it had done that on purpose. It was a message. I'm here. I'm watching. Do not test me. And yes, it came back every night I stayed there. The next 2 nights, I waited for it, listened for it. The last night, I was sitting in one of the booth seats with my back against a window, trying to read and keep myself calm. Somehow, it got right up to the bus before I realized it was there. No footsteps, no warning. Just that silence again. Then I felt it press its weight against the window behind me. The metal creaked. The window started to bow inward from the pressure. I swear, I nearly dropped dead right there. I moved to the middle of the bus and stayed there until morning, away from every wall, every window, every edge of that place. The next day, I left. I have never gone back.